There is a question that has been sitting in the middle of American history for a very long time, and almost nobody seems to want to ask it out loud. Not in schools, not in textbooks, not in the kinds of documentaries that get made about the founding of this country. The question is simple. In the span of a single human lifetime, a handful of families in the United States went from having almost nothing to controlling more wealth than most of the world's governments combined. And the official story we are given about how that happened is, if you look at it carefully enough, almost completely impossible. These families did not inherit their wealth. They did not win it in wars. They did not discover it buried in the ground, at least not in the way that story is usually told. According to the accepted version of history, they simply worked harder than everyone else. They were smarter than everyone else. They had better ideas than everyone else. And through pure grit and determination and a little bit of luck, they rose from nothing to become the most powerful economic forces the modern world had ever seen. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. But here is the thing about that story. The more you look at the actual historical record, the more you start noticing things that do not add up. Small things at first. A business deal that was made too quickly. A railroad route that was surveyed through land that nobody was supposed to own yet. A bank loan that was approved under conditions that should have been impossible for someone with no assets and no connections. A patent filed for a technology that, according to the official timeline, had not been invented yet. Little cracks in the official narrative. And then you start pulling on those threads, and the cracks get wider, and the story underneath the story starts to come into focus. And what you find there is not what you were taught in school. This is not a story about hardworking Americans who built something from nothing. This is a story about people who had access to something that the rest of America did not have access to. Something that was already here, already built, already functioning, long before the history books say it was. And the families that tapped into that something became the wealthiest dynasties in American history. And the something they tapped into has been, for reasons that will become clear as we go deeper into this, very carefully kept out of the official historical record. Let's start at the beginning. Or rather, let's start at what the history books call the beginning, and then let's start asking why it looks the way it does. In the decade between 1840 and 1850, the United States was, by most economic measures, a relatively modest country. The Industrial Revolution was just beginning to take hold in the northeastern states. Most of the American population was rural, farming-based, and living lives that were not dramatically different from what their grandparents had lived. The transportation network was primitive. Roads were often impassable. Rivers were the primary arteries of commerce. The country's banking system was fragmented, chaotic, and chronically unstable. Financial panics happened regularly, wiping out businesses and savings with almost clockwork regularity. This was the landscape into which, within the span of roughly 20 to 30 years, several families suddenly appeared and accumulated fortunes that, adjusted for today's dollars, would make them the wealthiest people who have ever lived on this planet. We are talking about figures that dwarf what any modern billionaire has accumulated. John D. Rockefeller's peak wealth, when properly adjusted, was somewhere in the range of $300 to $400 billion in today's money. Cornelius Vanderbilt, at his peak, controlled assets equivalent to more than $100 billion in today's currency. Andrew Carnegie's fortune, at the moment he sold Carnegie Steel, was the equivalent of roughly $300 billion today. J.P. Morgan, who was not merely wealthy but who functioned as essentially a private central bank for the entire United States economy, had influence over financial assets that exceeded the GDP of most of the world's nations. These fortunes did not accumulate slowly. They did not build up over multiple generations the way aristocratic wealth typically does. They exploded into existence within a single generation, often within a period of 10 to 15 years. And the question that nobody seems to want to sit with is this: where did the foundation come from? Because every one of these men, at the critical moment when their fortune began its exponential rise, made a move that should not have been possible given their stated circumstances. They accessed resources, infrastructure, or capital at a scale that simply was not available through any known or documented channel. And when you start mapping those moments, one family at a time, a pattern emerges that points not to exceptional individual genius, but to something much older, something that was already in place. Let's begin with Cornelius Vanderbilt, because his story is, in some ways, the most transparent, and the questions it raises are the clearest starting point for everything that follows. Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island, New York, to a family that was, by every available historical account, genuinely poor. His father was a farmer and part-time ferryman. The family had no significant assets. Cornelius had almost no formal education. By the time he was a teenager, he was working on the water, ferrying passengers and goods around New York Harbor in a small periauga, which is a type of flat-bottomed boat common in that era. And here is where the story, if you read it carefully, starts to develop its first unexplained wrinkle. By 1817, Vanderbilt, who was 23 years old and had been working as a ferry operator for less than a decade, somehow had enough capital and enough connections to become the operational captain of a steam-powered ferry service running on the Hudson River under the employment of Thomas Gibbons. Steam power in 1817 was not a casual technology. The steamboats of that era were expensive, mechanically complex, and required significant maintenance infrastructure. The routes on which they operated required not just the boats themselves, but docking facilities, fuel supplies, crew contracts, and established commercial relationships with the businesses and passengers who would use the service. Vanderbilt did not just operate this service. Within a very short period, he was essentially running the entire commercial apparatus behind it. He negotiated with suppliers, he managed the crews, he handled the legal disputes that arose when Gibbons's operation ran into conflict with the Fulton-Livingston monopoly that had been granted exclusive rights to steam navigation in New York waters. And he did all of this with an efficiency and sophistication that his biographical accounts attribute to natural genius. But there is something else going on in those years that the official histories tend to gloss over very quickly. Because Vanderbilt's understanding of the Hudson River system, of the commercial patterns along that river, of where the profitable routes were and where they would become profitable in the future, was not the understanding of a 23-year-old Staten Island ferry operator. It was the understanding of someone who had access to a much broader and more detailed map of American commerce than any such person should have possessed. When the Supreme Court handed down Gibbons v. Ogden in 1824, effectively breaking the Fulton-Livingston steam monopoly and opening American waterways to free navigation, Vanderbilt was positioned to move immediately and decisively. He already knew which routes to pursue. He already had relationships with the key players in those markets. He already understood the cost structures well enough to undercut competitors with precision. This is not the behavior of someone who got lucky. This is the behavior of someone who had foreknowledge and infrastructure. By 1829, Vanderbilt struck out on his own and began building what would become the most extensive transportation network in American history. And here is where the second unexplained wrinkle appears. The capital required to build that network was extraordinary. We are talking about dozens of steamboats, each costing tens of thousands of dollars in 1830s currency, which translates to millions of dollars in modern terms. We are talking about docking facilities, warehouse operations, legal teams, and political connections at the state and federal level. We are talking about a commercial intelligence network sophisticated enough to allow Vanderbilt to respond to competitors faster than they could respond to him, almost as if he knew their moves before they made them. Where did that capital come from? The official histories offer explanations that sound plausible until you try to run the actual numbers. They talk about profits from the ferry business, about careful reinvestment, about a talent for negotiation, but when you sit down and try to account for the actual dollar amounts involved, the math simply does not work. The capital that Vanderbilt deployed in the 1830s and 1840s was not capital that could have been accumulated through the operations he is documented as having run. There is a gap, a significant gap, and that gap has been noted by economic historians, usually in footnotes, and usually without much follow-up. Now let's set Vanderbilt aside for a moment and look at John D. Rockefeller, because his story contains something even more striking. Rockefeller was born in 1,839 inches, Richford, New York. His family was lower middle class. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman who had a habit of disappearing for months at a time and who was, by multiple contemporary accounts, not exactly a pillar of the community. John grew up in modest circumstances, received a standard public education, and by the age of 16 was working as a clerk for a produce commission firm in Cleveland, Ohio. By 23, he had formed a business partnership in the commodities trading business. This was 1863. 1 year later, he made his first investment in a crude oil refinery. 2 years after that, in 1865, He bought out his partners in that refinery for what historical accounts describe as a very favorable price. By 1870, he had founded Standard Oil. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining in the United States. By 1890, Rockefeller was the wealthiest man in the country and on his way to becoming, in real terms, the wealthiest man who has ever lived. The official explanation for this trajectory is that Rockefeller was an organizational genius who saw the chaos of the early oil industry and understood, before anyone else did, that the key to controlling the industry was not to control the oil in the ground, but to control the infrastructure that processed and distributed it. And this explanation is, as far as it goes, accurate. He did understand that. He was extraordinarily disciplined and methodical. His organizational abilities were genuinely remarkable, but the explanation, as it is usually presented, leaves out a question that should be asked very loudly. How did a 24-year-old commodities clerk know, in 1863, that petroleum was going to become the central energy source of the industrial world? This is not a trivial question. In 1863, petroleum was not yet the dominant fuel. The first commercial oil well in the United States had only been drilled 4 years earlier, in 1859, in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The industry was in complete chaos. Hundreds of small operators were drilling, speculating, losing money, going bankrupt. Most serious investors of that era considered oil a volatile and unreliable commodity. The smart money, if anything, was going into coal, which had a long-established track record. Yet Rockefeller, in 1863, not only invested in oil refining, but did so with a clarity of vision that seems to have been absolute from the beginning. He never wavered. He never diversified into other industries the way a hedging investor would. He went all in, immediately and completely, on the proposition that petroleum refining was going to be the center of the American economy. How did he know? The official answer is that he was simply smarter than everyone else, that he could see what others could not. And perhaps that is true, but there is another possibility. And to understand that possibility, you have to understand something about the geography of early American oil development that the history books tend to skip over very quickly. The oil that Rockefeller built his empire on came primarily from a specific region of western Pennsylvania and western New York. This is important, because that region, in the years before commercial oil development began, was already crisscrossed with a surprisingly sophisticated network of roads, paths, and water routes that bore a remarkable resemblance to what a transportation and distribution infrastructure for a liquid commodity would look like if someone had planned it in advance. The Native American populations of that region, specifically the Seneca people who were part of the Iroquois Confederacy, had long known about the oil seeps in that area. The Seneca called the oil Seneca oil and had been using it for medicinal and ritual purposes for generations. But there is something else about that region that most histories of the oil industry either ignore or mention only in passing. The geological surveys of western Pennsylvania and western New York, conducted in the 1830s and 1840s, were not publicly released in their complete form. The detailed survey data, including information about the depth, location, and estimated volume of petroleum deposits in that region, was compiled by agencies connected to both state governments and to private interests that included several individuals who would later have financial relationships with John D. Rockefeller. You have to let that sit for a moment. Before the first commercial oil well was drilled, before the oil boom began, before any of the wildcatting chaos of the 1850s, there existed detailed geological information about the oil deposits of that region. And that information was in the hands of people who were connected to Rockefeller's early financial backers. This does not prove that Rockefeller had advanced knowledge, but it suggests very strongly that his certainty about the future of petroleum was not simply the product of visionary thinking, it was the product of access. Access to information and access to infrastructure that existed before the official history of American oil development says it should have existed. And this is the pattern that repeats over and over when you look at the founding fortunes of America's great dynasties. Not luck, not genius, though genius played a role, not hard work, though these were often genuinely hard-working people, but access. Access to something that was already there. Let us go further back. Let's talk about the land itself. Because one of the most peculiar features of American economic history in the 19th century is the speed with which certain individuals and families were able to acquire title to enormous tracts of land at precisely the moment those tracts became economically valuable. This is not the normal pattern of land speculation. In normal land speculation, speculators buy land cheaply, hope that development will increase its value, and sometimes win and sometimes lose. What happened with the great American fortunes was different. The land that the key families acquired tended to be land that became valuable, not because of general development, but because of very specific infrastructure that was built on or through it. Railroads, canals, river ports, mining operations. And the timing of those acquisitions, when you plot them against the timing of the infrastructure decisions that made them valuable, is consistently too precise to be explained by luck. These families were not speculating, they were operating on knowledge. The Astor family is a useful illustration here. John Jacob Astor was born in 1763 inches, a small village in Germany, and arrived in the United States in 1784 with, according to his own account, almost nothing. He worked in a music store, traded in furs, and built the American Fur Company into the dominant force in the North American fur trade by the early 1800s. But Astor's real wealth did not come from fur. It came from Manhattan real estate. And the story of how he came to acquire that real estate contains one of the more extraordinary coincidences in American economic history. Astor began systematically buying Manhattan real estate in the 1790s. He focused his acquisitions on specific parts of the island. The northern sections, which at the time were largely undeveloped farmland and woodland, and he bought these properties with an almost aggressive disregard for their current value, paying prices that his contemporaries often described as excessive for what the land was actually worth at the time of purchase. But Astor knew something. He knew, or rather he appears to have known, exactly how Manhattan was going to develop. His acquisitions tracked, almost perfectly, the expansion pattern of the city decades before that expansion occurred. He bought land in areas that became valuable 30 and 40 years later, and he bought it with a precision that suggests he was not guessing. He was reading a map of future development. Where did that map come from? The official histories give you answers about Astor's intelligence and foresight, and he was certainly intelligent. But there is another piece of this story that is almost never mentioned in popular accounts. Astor's fur trading empire, the American Fur Company, gave him access to an extraordinarily detailed geographic and commercial intelligence network that covered not just the American frontier but extended deep into areas that were, officially, unknown or unsettled territory. The fur trade required relationships with Native American communities across an enormous geographic area. Those relationships, maintained through decades of commercial contact, gave Astor's agents access to geographic and resource information about the North American interior that far exceeded what was available through any official government survey. The American Fur Company's network of trading posts and agents extended from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest and from Canada down through the Mississippi River Valley. It was, in effect, a private intelligence and logistics network of continental scope, and that network gave Astor not just information about the fur trade, it gave him information about the land itself, about water routes, about mineral deposits, about the patterns of seasonal flooding and drainage that would determine which areas were developable and which were not, about the locations of ancient pathways and trails that, because they had been established through centuries of practical use by people who understood the landscape intimately, would naturally become the routes along which modern infrastructure would eventually be built. This last point is crucial, and it connects to something that has been almost entirely written out of American historical consciousness. The trail systems of North America were not random. They were not accidental. The pathways that Native American communities used for trade, travel, and communication across the continent were, in many cases, the product of thousands of years of accumulated practical knowledge about geography, terrain, hydrology, and seasonal conditions. These were optimized routes that chose the best river crossings, that avoided the worst terrain, that connected to water sources and defensible high ground, that had been tested and refined over millennia. And those routes, when European and American settlers began building their own transportation infrastructure, became the foundations for roads, canals, and railroads. Not always, not everywhere, but with a frequency that is striking once you start looking for it. The National Road, which was the first major federally funded highway in American history, followed a path through the Appalachian Mountains that closely tracked a system of Native American trails that had been in use for centuries before European contact. The Erie Canal, which was the engineering marvel that connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River and transformed the economy of the northeastern United States, followed a geographic corridor through the Mohawk Valley that Native American communities had been using as a transit route for trade and communication for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The transcontinental railroad routes, as they were surveyed in the 1850s and 1860s, repeatedly discovered that the best mountain passes and the most navigable river crossings were places that already had established trails, and those trails frequently turned out to be paths that Native American communities had maintained for generations. This is not a coincidence. This is information, and the families that had access to that information, through fur trade networks, through military relationships, through the work of surveyors and agents who operated on the frontier, were the families that knew, before the public knew, where the valuable land was, where the railroads would go, where the cities would grow, where the wealth would accumulate, and that knowledge was a form of capital that did not appear on any balance sheet. Capital that the official histories of American economic development have never fully accounted for. Now let's go even deeper, because what I have described so far, while it raises important questions, still operates within a conventional historical framework. Access to information, early mover advantage, sophisticated intelligence networks, these are real phenomena, and they genuinely explain part of what happened. But they do not explain everything, and the part they do not explain is the part that gets genuinely strange. Because when you look at certain specific moments in the histories of these great fortunes, you encounter things that do not fit the access to information model. You encounter infrastructure, physical infrastructure that existed, documented, and operational before the historical record says it should have been possible to build it. Let's talk about the railroads. Specifically, let's talk about the financial engineering behind the Transcontinental Railroad, because there is a story buried in the history of that project that almost nobody knows, and that story points towards something fundamental about where the first American fortunes came from. The Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864 authorized the construction of the first transcontinental railroad across the United States. The project was to be carried out by two companies, the Union Pacific Railroad, building west from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific Railroad, building east from Sacramento, California. The federal government would support the project through land grants and bond issues. This much is well known. What is less well known is the financial architecture of the project. Because the financial architecture of the Transcontinental Railroad contained one of the most elaborate mechanisms for transferring public wealth to private hands that has ever been constructed in American history. And the people who built that mechanism had access to engineering and financial knowledge that, when you trace it back to its source, leads you somewhere unexpected. The Credit Mobilier scandal, which broke in 1872 and was one of the great political scandals of the 19th century, revealed that the Union Pacific Railroad had been systematically defrauding the federal government and its investors. The mechanism was a construction company, Credit Mobilier of America, which was secretly owned by the same people who owned the railroad. The railroad paid Credit Mobilier vastly inflated prices for construction work. Credit Mobilier distributed the excess profits to its shareholders, who were the railroad's directors. The federal government, which was providing the financing, was essentially paying the railroad's owners enormous personal fortunes in exchange for work that cost a fraction of what was being charged. This has been analyzed extensively as a political and financial scandal. But there is something about the technical side of the Credit Mobilier scheme that has received almost no attention, because the financial engineering required to set up Credit Mobilier, to structure the contracts in the right way, to ensure that the money flowed correctly while maintaining the appearance of legitimate construction financing, was extraordinarily sophisticated. This was not the kind of financial sophistication that existed widely in 1860s America. The American banking system of that era was relatively primitive. Modern concepts of corporate finance, of subsidiary structures, of the use of holding companies to separate liability from profit, were in their infancy. The Credit Mobilier structure was, in financial terms, decades ahead of what the conventional history of American finance says should have been available. Where did that sophistication come from? The answer, when you follow the documentary trail, leads to a set of financial relationships that connect back to European banking houses, and specifically to financial institutions in France and Britain that had been operating with exactly this kind of structural sophistication since at least the early 18th century. The Credit Mobilier of America was modeled, explicitly and directly, on the Credit Mobilier de France, which had been established in Paris in 1852 by the Pereira brothers, and which had pioneered exactly the kind of industrial financing structure that was later used to extract wealth from the American Transcontinental Railroad project. And the people who brought that model to America, who adapted it to American conditions and applied it to American infrastructure projects, were connected to a network of financial relationships that extended much further back in time and much deeper into European and American elite society than the standard histories of American finance acknowledge. We will come back to these connections, but first let's talk about the land itself, because there is a layer of this story that goes beneath the financial engineering, beneath the railroad deals, beneath the real estate speculation. There is a layer that involves the physical ground on which all of this was built. And that layer contains mysteries that have never been satisfactorily explained. In the 1830s and 1840s, as the great American fortunes were beginning their explosive ascent, surveyors working for various state and federal agencies were making a discovery that has never fully entered the mainstream historical consciousness. They were finding, scattered across the interior of North America, evidence of infrastructure that should not have existed. Not primitive camps or village sites, not the kind of archaeological material that historians comfortably assign to pre-Columbian Native American cultures. Something different. Something that the surveyors and explorers of that era described in their field reports with a combination of fascination and confusion, and that those same field reports, in many cases, either never made it into the public record or were published only in heavily edited form. We are talking about mound complexes, road systems, engineered earthworks on a scale that rivaled the great construction projects of the ancient world. And we are talking about these things being encountered not as ancient ruins, in the way that Egyptian or Greek ruins are encountered, but as functional or near-functional infrastructure, still present in the landscape, still defining the geography of the regions through which the great American fortunes were being built. The Hopewell culture and the Mississippian culture, which archaeologists now recognize as having built elaborate earthwork complexes across the interior of North America from roughly 2,000 years ago to roughly 500 years ago, left behind a physical legacy that is, even in its degraded and partially destroyed form, genuinely astonishing. At their peak, these cultures built earthwork mounds that in some cases exceeded the volume of the Great Pyramid of Giza. They constructed geometric enclosures that covered thousands of acres with mathematical precision. They maintained trade networks that connected communities from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. These facts are not disputed by mainstream archaeology. They are taught in university courses. They appear in scholarly journals. They are simply not taught in popular American culture, not discussed in the way that comparable ancient civilizations in other parts of the world are discussed, and not connected, in any meaningful way, to the economic history of the 19th century. But they should be, because the geographic footprint of the great Hopewell and Mississippian earthwork complexes overlaps, with a precision that is not accidental, with the geography of American economic development in the 19th century. The Ohio Valley, which was the heartland of Hopewell culture, became the heartland of American industrial development. The Mississippi River Corridor, which was the spine of Mississippian civilization, became the spine of American agricultural and commercial expansion. The Great Lakes region, where these two cultural spheres intersected, became the site of some of the most intensive industrial and extractive activity in American history. This is not a coincidence of geography in the narrow sense. It is not simply that people settled where the land was productive. The relationship is more specific and more precise than that. The actual sites of major earthwork complexes, the great ceremonial centers, the major mound groups, the elaborate geometric enclosures, these sites are distributed across the landscape in a pattern that, when you overlay it on a map of 19th century American industrial and transportation development, lines up in ways that are difficult to explain through independent invention. The Mound City complex in Ross County, Ohio, which is one of the best preserved Hopewell ceremonial sites in North America, sits at the confluence of the North Fork and the main channel of the Scioto River. The Scioto River was a primary transportation artery for early European American settlement of the Ohio interior. The town of Chillicothe, which was the first and second capital of the state of Ohio, was established directly adjacent to this mound complex. The early economic development of the Ohio Valley, including the agricultural surplus that fed the expansion of American manufacturing in the Northeast, was routed through the same river system that the Hopewell builders had, millennia earlier, identified as a key geographic nexus. The Great Cahokia Complex near present-day St. Louis, Illinois, which at its peak around the year 1100 CE was one of the largest cities in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere, sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. This location, which the Mississippian people had identified as one of the most strategically important geographic points in interior North America, became the site of St. Louis, which became the gateway city for American westward expansion. The economic geography of American westward development flowed through precisely the location that had been identified as critical by a civilization that existed centuries before European contact. And when you look at the actual mechanics of American westward expansion in the 19th century, the railroad routes, the river navigation improvements, the land survey systems, you find something that the official history of that expansion does not explain. You find evidence that the people who were making the key decisions about where to build and what to develop were operating with knowledge of the landscape that went beyond what official surveys had provided. They knew things about water, about terrain, about where the buildable ground was and where it was not, about which river crossings were reliable in all seasons and which were not, about where the mineral deposits were located and how to access them. And some of that knowledge came from sources that the official histories do not acknowledge. It came from the physical legacy of the people who had lived in that landscape for thousands of years before European contact. It came from the earthworks, the road systems, the trade routes, the landscape modifications that those cultures had left behind. And it was accessed, at least in part, through networks of information and relationship that the great American fortunes were perfectly positioned to exploit. Now, we need to talk about something that makes this story even more complicated and even more interesting. We need to talk about what happened to the physical evidence of these earlier civilizations. Because one of the most striking things about the history of American earthwork destruction in the 19th century is how systematic it was and who benefited from that destruction. In the decades between 1820 and 1880, thousands of mound complexes across the Ohio Valley, the Mississippi River corridor, and the Great Lakes region were destroyed. Some were plowed under by farmers who found the earth of the mound fill exceptionally fertile. Some were excavated by relic hunters seeking the copper ornaments, mica sheets, obsidian blades, and other trade goods that were buried with the dead in Hopewell and Mississippian ceremonial mounds. Some were deliberately leveled to make way for railroad construction, road building, or urban development. The destruction was so comprehensive and so rapid that by the time professional archaeology began to take an interest in these sites in the late 19th century, a significant proportion of what had existed had already been lost, and what had been lost, in many cases, could never be fully recovered. The context, the spatial relationships between mounds, the stratigraphy that would have allowed researchers to understand the sequence and function of construction, the organic materials that would have allowed dating, these things were gone. But here is what is interesting about the pattern of destruction. The sites that were destroyed most completely and most quickly were not randomly distributed. They tended to be the sites that were in the path of specific infrastructure projects, the sites that were adjacent to canal routes, that sat on land that would be needed for railroad construction, that occupied ground that specific investors were acquiring. And the people who were acquiring that ground often did so before the infrastructure projects that would make the ground valuable were publicly announced. This pattern has been noticed by archaeologists. They're usually discussed in terms of cultural insensitivity and commercial priorities rather than deliberate strategy. But when you look at specific cases, the picture that emerges is more specific and more troubling. Consider the fate of the Newark earthworks in central Ohio. The Newark complex, which was one of the most elaborate geometric earthwork systems in North America, covering an area of roughly 4 square miles with a series of precise geometric enclosures connected by graded roadways, was still largely intact in the 1820s. By the 1870s, the majority of it had been destroyed. The Great Circle, one of the main enclosures, survived because it had been converted into a fairground and later became a state memorial. But the rest of the complex, the octagon, the ellipse, the connecting avenues, most of it was gone, plowed under, built over, quarried for fill. The destruction of the Newark earthworks occurred during precisely the period when the Licking County region of Ohio was being developed as an agricultural and commercial hub, when the canal systems that would connect it to the broader Ohio economy were being built, And when land in the area was being acquired by interests connected to the same networks of capital that were building the great American fortunes, the timing of the destruction tracked the timing of the development. And the development was, in several documented cases, planned and implemented by people who were part of the financial networks that would eventually consolidate into the dynastic wealth of the Gilded Age. Is this evidence of deliberate destruction of evidence? That is a strong claim, and it requires careful handling. The more modest claim, which is nonetheless significant, is that the destruction of these sites happened in conjunction with, and often preceded by, the acquisition of the surrounding land by interests connected to the great American fortunes, and that the people making those acquisitions were doing so with knowledge of what the land was worth and what it would be worth, knowledge that was not available to the general public. And some of that knowledge may have come from what was in the mounds themselves. Because the objects that were recovered from these sites before and during their destruction were not merely archaeological curiosities, they were evidence of a commerce and a technology that rewrites the standard story of pre-Columbian North America, and what they reveal about the sophistication of the cultures that built them suggests that the geography of early American economic development was not shaped by chance. It was shaped by the inheritance of an older civilization's infrastructure. Let me tell you about the copper, because the copper is one of the places where this story gets genuinely extraordinary. The Hopewell culture used copper in quantities that, when you think about the logistics required to extract and work it, are almost incomprehensible. The primary source of that copper was the Lake Superior region, specifically the Keweenaw Peninsula of what is now Michigan and the shores of Isle Royale in Lake Superior. These areas contain some of the richest native copper deposits in the world, and those deposits were mined extensively and systematically by the cultures that preceded the Hopewell. Archaeological evidence indicates that copper was being extracted from the Lake Superior deposits as far back as 5,000 years ago, and that the scale of extraction over the millennia was enormous. Archaeologists have identified thousands of ancient mining pits in the Lake Superior copper region. These pits were not small-scale operations. Some of them are hundreds of feet long and tens of feet deep. The total volume of copper extracted from these deposits over the centuries of pre-Columbian mining is estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands of tons, at minimum. This is an industrial-scale mining operation, an operation that required organized labor, sophisticated logistical planning, and probably some form of centralized coordination. And the copper that came out of those mines traveled, through trade networks, across enormous distances, turning up in Hopewell ceremonial contexts in Ohio, in Mississippian sites along the Gulf Coast, in cultures in the American Southwest, and in sites along the Atlantic seaboard. Now here is the thing about the Lake Superior copper deposits that the official history of American industrial development tends to gloss over very quickly. When American mining companies began developing the Lake Superior copper region in the 1840s, they found something that should have surprised them much more than it apparently did. They found that the most accessible and most productive deposits had already been mined, extensively. The ancient mining pits were everywhere, and in those pits, they found not just evidence of mining activity but actual mining tools, and, in some cases, partially worked copper that had been abandoned, sometimes with tools still lying next to it, as if work had stopped suddenly and never resumed. The official history explains this as the product of prehistoric peoples using primitive techniques over thousands of years, and that explanation is partially correct. But it glosses over something important. The scale of what had already been removed from those deposits, when estimated by the archaeologists who studied the ancient mines in the 19th and early 20th centuries, suggests an operation of a magnitude that strains the boundaries of what we typically imagine when we think about pre-Columbian North America. And the American mining companies that developed the Lake Superior copper region in the 19th century, the companies that became the foundation of several of the great American industrial fortunes, did not discover those deposits through geological survey. They found them because the ancient mines were visible on the surface. Because the ancient miners had already done the work of identifying the richest deposits and extracting the most accessible copper, the great 19th century mining fortunes of the Lake Superior region were built, in significant part, on the legacy of a mining civilization that the official history of North America barely acknowledges. But the copper story goes even deeper, because there is a mystery at the heart of the Lake Superior ancient mining operation that has never been satisfactorily resolved. The mystery is simply this: where did all the copper go? The estimates of the volume of copper removed from the Lake Superior deposits by ancient miners range from around 500,000 tons on the conservative end to over 1 billion tons on the more speculative end. Even taking the most conservative estimate, this is an extraordinary quantity of metal. And yet the archaeological record of the cultures that are supposed to have mined and used this copper accounts for only a tiny fraction of it. The copper objects found in Hopewell and Mississippian sites, while impressive in their craftsmanship and in the distances they traveled through trade networks, represent a quantity of copper that is orders of magnitude smaller than the estimated extraction. If hundreds of thousands of tons of copper were removed from the Lake Superior deposits over the millennia, where did it go? This question was asked by 19th century researchers who were among the first to seriously study the ancient Lake Superior mines. And they could not answer it then. We cannot answer it now. The copper is missing. And the absence of that copper in the archaeological record of North America is one of the genuine mysteries of pre-Columbian history. Some researchers have proposed that the copper was used in forms that have not been preserved, organic matrix composites or trade goods that have since decomposed. Some have suggested that the quantities removed have been overestimated. Some have gone much further and proposed that the copper was part of a transoceanic trade network that connected pre-Columbian North America to civilizations in Europe, Africa, or Asia. The transoceanic hypothesis is speculative and contested. But it is not as easy to dismiss as the mainstream historical establishment tends to suggest. Because the timing of the ancient Lake Superior copper mining operations, particularly the intense activity that seems to have occurred between roughly 3000 BCE and 1000 BCE, coincides with periods in Old World history when copper and bronze were in extraordinarily high demand. The Bronze Age in Europe and the Middle East depended on access to copper in quantities that the known Old World deposits may not have been sufficient to supply. And the chemical signature of Lake Superior copper, which is exceptionally pure, is distinctive enough that in theory, it should be detectable in Old World bronze artifacts if Lake Superior copper was being used in Old World metalworking. Some researchers have claimed to have found exactly that. The claims are controversial. The mainstream archaeological establishment is deeply skeptical, but the skepticism has not been accompanied by a satisfactory alternative explanation for where the copper went. And this brings us to a question that connects the ancient mining mystery to the 19th century fortune-building story in a way that might initially seem surprising. Because the people who first seriously investigated the ancient Lake Superior mines in the 1840s were not disinterested scholars. They were agents of the very mining companies that were about to develop those deposits commercially. And the reports they filed about what they found in the ancient mines included not just descriptions of the mining pits and the tools left behind, but also information about the distribution of the deposits, the depth and character of the ore-bearing layers, and the locations of the most productive areas. That information, which was compiled by the agents of private mining interests before any comprehensive public geological survey had been conducted, became the foundation for the mining fortunes that were built in the Lake Superior region in the second half of the 19th century. The Calumet and Hecla Mining Company, which was one of the most profitable copper mining operations in American history, was founded in 1871 and developed its operations on ground that had been identified by the ancient miners and recorded by the agents of private interests before the official geological surveys were completed. The people who owned Calumet and Hecla were connected to the Boston financial establishment and specifically to a set of investment networks that overlapped significantly with the networks that were simultaneously building fortunes in railroads, real estate, and oil. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply the way capital worked in 19th century America. Information flowed through networks. Networks were built through relationships, and the relationships that mattered most were the ones that gave access to information that was not available to the general public. But the information that was flowing through those networks in the 1840s and 1850s was not just financial information, it was geographic information. It was archaeological information. It was the information that came from the actual investigation of what was in the ground and what had been done with it before. And that information suggested something that the official history of North America was not, and is still not, entirely ready to accommodate. It suggested that the economic geography of North America had been shaped by a civilization, or a series of civilizations, whose sophistication and whose reach we have consistently underestimated. Let's talk about the roads, because beyond the mounds and beyond the mines, there is another layer of ancient infrastructure in North America that the official history consistently minimizes. And that layer is arguably more important to the story of the 19th century fortunes than either the mounds or the mines. The great pre-Columbian civilizations of North America were not just builders of earthworks and miners of copper. They were builders of roads, actual engineered roads, graded and maintained, connecting major population centers across enormous distances. We know this most clearly from the Southwest, where the ancestral Puebloan culture built a road system centered on Chaco Canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico that has been extensively documented and studied. The Chaco road system included roads up to 30 feet wide, engineered with raised berms and drainage features, extending for distances of hundreds of miles in straight lines across difficult terrain. But the Southwest is not the only place where ancient road systems have been documented. In the Southeast, the Mississippian culture maintained road systems connecting major mound centers. These roads are harder to trace than the Chaco roads because the climate and vegetation of the Southeast are less conducive to the preservation of surface features. But traces of them have been found, and the geographic logic of the Mississippian settlement system, with its hierarchy of major and minor mound centers connected through clearly defined corridors, implies a road network even where one cannot be directly observed. And, in the Northeast, the territory of the Iroquois Confederacy and its predecessors, there is an ancient trail system that has been documented since the earliest period of European contact, and that shows characteristics suggesting it was not simply a collection of informal paths, but a deliberately engineered and maintained transportation network. The trails of the Iroquois territory followed ridgelines with a consistency that speaks to deliberate planning. They crossed streams at the shallowest and most stable fords. They connected, through well-established waypoints, the major population centers of the region. These trails did not disappear when European settlers arrived. They became the basis for European-American transportation routes. The old Iroquois trails became colonial roads. Colonial roads became turnpikes. Turnpikes became the routes along which early railroads were surveyed. And the routes of the railroads determined the locations of the cities and towns that grew up along them, which in turn determined the value of the surrounding land, which in turn determined where the great 19th century fortunes were concentrated. The people who understood this chain of causation before it became visible to the general public were the people who built the great American fortunes. And they understood it not because they were geniuses who could see the future, but because they had access to information about the past, about what had been built, about where the infrastructure was, about how the landscape had been organized by the people who had lived in it for thousands of years before European contact. Now let's bring in a figure who is central to this story but who is rarely discussed in this context. Let's talk about Albert Gallatin. Albert Gallatin is not a household name in the way that Rockefeller or Vanderbilt or Carnegie are household names. He was the Secretary of the Treasury under Presidents Jefferson and Madison. He served in that role for 13 years, from 1801 to 1814, making him the longest-serving Treasury Secretary in American history. He was a brilliant man, genuinely one of the intellectual giants of the early American Republic. And he spent much of his later life, after his government service, engaged in a project that has never received the historical attention it deserves. In 1836, Gallatin published a work titled A Synopsis of the Indian Tribes within the United States east of the Rocky Mountains and in the British and Russian possessions in North America. This work, which is the foundation of American ethnology as a formal discipline, was the first systematic attempt to classify and map the Native American cultures and languages of North America. And embedded in that work, almost as background information for the linguistic and cultural analysis, was a detailed mapping of the trade routes, trail systems, and geographic knowledge of the cultures Gallatin was studying. Gallatin had spent decades collecting this information. Through his government service, through his relationships with the diplomatic and military establishments of the early republic, through his personal connections to the exploration networks that were mapping the American interior, he had assembled a picture of the geographic organization of pre-Columbian North America that was, at the time, probably more comprehensive than anything that had previously existed in a single place. And that picture included information about transportation routes, about resource locations, about the relationships between geographic features and human settlement patterns that was directly relevant to the economic development questions that were simultaneously being worked out by the emerging American investment community. Gallatin was not a secret figure. His work was published and circulated, but the people who read it most carefully, who extracted from it the most useful economic intelligence, were not ethnologists. They were investors, developers, and the agents of the great financial networks that were beginning to consolidate American capital in the middle decades of the 19th century. This is speculative, in the sense that we do not have documentary evidence of specific individuals reading Gallatin and making specific investment decisions based on what they read. But the geographic intelligence contained in Gallatin's work, and in the broader tradition of ethnological and geographical research that he helped to establish, was available to anyone who was looking for it. And the investment patterns of the emerging American fortunes suggest very strongly that someone was looking for it. The railroads again provide the clearest illustration. When the various competing proposals for transcontinental railroad routes were being evaluated in the 1850s, the geographic arguments for specific routes drew heavily on the accumulated knowledge of Native American trail systems and geographic intelligence. The Pacific Railroad Survey reports, published by the War Department between 1855 and 1860, explicitly drew on information about Native American travel routes and geographic knowledge in assessing the feasibility of different mountain crossing options. And the people who had access to that survey information before it was published, through the military and political connections that were standard equipment for the emerging American financial elite, were the people who were able to position themselves most advantageously in the land acquisition process that preceded and accompanied the railroad construction. So what we have is a picture in which the great American fortunes of the 19th century were built not simply on hard work and vision, though those things were real, but on access to a kind of capital that most Americans did not know existed: geographic capital, archaeological capital, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human occupation of the North American landscape, encoded in the trail systems and earthwork complexes and mineral workings of the cultures that preceded European contact. And that capital was being systematically converted into financial capital, through a process that the official history of American economic development describes as pioneering entrepreneurship, but that looks, from a different angle, like the exploitation of an inheritance that the public never knew it had. Let's now turn to something that runs alongside this geographic story and that adds another dimension to the mystery. Let's talk about the water. Water is the most important geographic resource in the continental United States. Not oil, not coal, not copper. Water. And the pattern of water resource exploitation in the 19th century, the canals, the river navigation improvements, the early water-powered industrial sites, follows a geography that, like the railroad geography, tracks the ancient infrastructure of pre-Columbian North America with a precision that is difficult to explain through independent survey and planning. The Erie Canal, which was built between 1817 and 1825, is the most famous example. The canal followed a route through upstate New York that the Iroquois had used as a major transportation corridor for centuries. The geographic logic of that corridor, the way the Mohawk River Valley provided a natural low point in the Appalachian Barrier that allowed relatively easy passage from the Hudson River drainage to the Great Lakes, was not something that the early 19th century engineers discovered through fresh survey. It was something that the indigenous people of the region had understood and exploited for generations, and that European American settlers had been using informally since the earliest period of colonial contact. But the Erie Canal was not just a geographic inevitability, it was a specific engineering and financial achievement, and the people who built it, and the people who profited most from it, were operating with a clarity of vision about its commercial potential that, once again, is difficult to explain entirely in terms of the information that was officially available to them at the time. DeWitt Clinton, who was the primary political champion of the Erie Canal project, faced intense skepticism from the financial establishment of his time. The project was widely described as Clinton's ditch in a contemptuous tone, as an expensive folly that would never pay for itself. Yet within a decade of its completion, it had transformed the economy of the northeastern United States, made New York City the dominant commercial center of the country, and generated profits for the state of New York and for the private investors along its route that far exceeded what even its most optimistic proponents had predicted. How did Clinton know it would work? His advocates say he was visionary, his detractors said he was lucky, but there is a third possibility. Clinton had access to information about the commercial geography of the interior of North America through his political and diplomatic connections and through the accumulated geographic intelligence of the fur trade networks that allowed him to see what others could not. He knew, or could reasonably infer from what he knew, what the commercial geography of the Great Lakes region looked like, and how transformative a reliable water connection between that geography and the Atlantic coast would be. And the people who positioned themselves to profit from the canal's construction, who acquired land along its route before the route was publicly confirmed, who built the infrastructure businesses that would service the canal traffic, these people were not guessing. They were reading information that most people did not have access to, and some of that information came from the same ancient knowledge base that we have been tracing through this story. Now, let me introduce a concept that will be important for the next part of this exploration. The concept is what I will call the geography of extraction. It is the observation that the places where the great American fortunes were built, the places where coal was mined, where oil was extracted, where copper was worked, where timber was harvested, where water was diverted for industrial power, these places were not randomly distributed across the landscape. They were concentrated in specific geographic areas, and those geographic areas had been identified by the cultures that preceded European contact as resource-rich locations worthy of sustained exploitation. This is not mystical. It is not a claim about hidden knowledge or ancient wisdom in some esoteric sense. It is a simple geographic observation. The places where resources exist in the ground are determined by geology. Geology does not change on human timescales. The people who lived in North America for thousands of years before European contact had, through the practical necessities of survival, developed an extraordinarily detailed understanding of where those resources were located. That understanding was encoded in their settlement patterns, their trade routes, their ceremonial sites, and their oral traditions. And when European American civilization began its expansion across the continent, the people who understood that this ancient knowledge existed and who figured out how to access it had an enormous advantage over those who were starting from scratch with official surveys and frontier exploration. The great American fortunes were built by people who understood, at some level, that they were not pioneering an empty landscape. They were developing a landscape that had already been mapped, already been surveyed, already been economically organized by civilizations whose existence the official historical narrative consistently understated. Now I want to take us somewhere specific, to a place and a story that brings all of these threads together in a way that is almost impossibly concentrated. I want to tell you about the Mesabi Range. The Mesabi Range is a geological formation in northeastern Minnesota, a long, low ridge of iron-bearing rock stretching roughly 100 miles in an east-west orientation through the landscape of the Arrowhead region of the state. The iron deposits of the Mesabi Range are among the richest in the world. At their peak, they supplied something like 2/3 of all the iron ore used by American steel mills. Without the Mesabi Range iron, the American steel industry could not have built the infrastructure of the modern United States. The railroads, the bridges, the skyscrapers, the ships, the machines, all of it depended, at its foundation, on Mesabi iron. The Mesabi Range was opened for commercial mining in the 1890s. The story of how it was opened and who controlled it from the beginning is one of the most revealing stories in American economic history. The official account goes something like this. Iron deposits in the Mesabi Range were discovered in 1890 by Lewis Merritt and his brothers, who were timber cruisers working in northeastern Minnesota. The Merritts were local men, sons of a timber explorer who had worked the region for decades. They recognized the geological significance of what they found, secured mining leases, and began developing the deposits. They ran into financial difficulty. John D. Rockefeller provided rescue financing. The Merritts lost control of their leases to Rockefeller. Rockefeller later sold his Mesabi holdings to J.P. Morgan, who combined them with Andrew Carnegie's steel operations to form United States Steel in 1901. This is the official story. It is true as far as it goes, but it leaves out some things that matter enormously. First, the Merritt brothers did not discover the Mesabi iron deposits in the sense that they were the first human beings to know about them. The Ojibwe people of northeastern Minnesota had known about the iron-bearing rocks of the Mesabi Range for generations before the Merritts arrived. The Ojibwe word for the region, which roughly translates as sleeping giant or great sleeping one, refers to a geographic and mythological framework that incorporated the iron-bearing ridge into a much older understanding of the landscape. The iron itself was part of the material culture of the region, used by Ojibwe craftspeople in limited quantities for tools and ornaments. More importantly, the geological survey work that eventually confirmed the commercial potential of the Mesabi deposits was not conducted by the Merritt brothers. It was conducted over a period of decades by geological surveyors whose work was available to anyone who was paying attention. And some of the most important early survey work on the Mesabi was conducted by Henry Houghton Ames, who was Minnesota's state geologist in the 1860s, and whose 1,866 report on the iron deposits of northeastern Minnesota was explicit about the commercial potential of the region. That report was published in 1866. The Merritts claimed to have discovered the Mesabi Range commercially in 1890. That is a 24-year gap between the publication of a geological report explicitly describing the commercial potential of iron deposits in a specific region and the supposed discovery of those deposits. And during those 24 years, the people who had access to the geological literature, the people who were already connected to the iron and steel industries of the eastern United States, had every opportunity to position themselves advantageously with respect to those deposits. John D. Rockefeller's rapid move into Mesabi iron in 1893, which he presented as a rescue of the financially troubled Merritt brothers, was not a coincidence of timing. Rockefeller, through his relationships with the geological and financial establishment of the northeastern United States, almost certainly knew about the Mesabi deposits long before the Merritts began their commercial development. And his move into those deposits, timed to coincide with the moment of maximum financial vulnerability for the people who had done the actual work of opening the mines, was characteristic of the way the great American fortunes operated. They did not pioneer, they positioned. They waited for the moment when the preliminary work had been done by others, and then moved in with overwhelming financial force. And the moment they chose was never random. It was always calculated. Calculated on the basis of information that they had, and others did not. Information about what was in the ground, information about what the infrastructure of exploitation would cost, and how long it would take. Information about who else was moving toward the same resource, and how financially strong those competitors were. This was the great American fortune-making machine, and it ran, in significant part, on geographic and geological intelligence that went back much further than the 19th century surveys. Because the ancient peoples of the Lake Superior region had known about the iron ore, they had worked with it, in limited quantities, using the same instinct for resource identification that had led their predecessors to the copper deposits of the Keweenaw Peninsula. The Ojibwe oral traditions contain references to the iron-bearing rocks of the Mesabi that are clear enough that, when 19th century missionaries and government agents began recording those traditions, the geographic information they contained was practically a treasure map for someone who knew what to look for. And the people who were collecting and systematizing that geographic intelligence in the early 19th century were not just disinterested scholars. They were agents of the state, of the military, of the fur trade networks, and of the emerging investment establishments of the eastern United States. The systematic collection of Native American geographic knowledge in the first half of the 19th century was, among other things, an economic intelligence operation, an operation that translated thousands of years of accumulated practical knowledge about the North American landscape into actionable investment information for the people who had the capital to act on it. This is not a comfortable history. It is not the story of pioneering entrepreneurs building something from nothing. It is a story of extraction. Extraction of resources from the ground, yes, but also extraction of knowledge. Knowledge that belonged to the people who had accumulated it over generations, and that was taken from them, sometimes gently and sometimes brutally, and converted into the foundation for fortunes that shaped the modern world. And it is a story that has been carefully kept at the margins of American historical consciousness. Not through any single act of deliberate suppression, though some deliberate suppression certainly occurred, but through the accumulated weight of a narrative tradition that privileged certain stories and ignored others, that celebrated the founding of Standard Oil and United States Steel while glossing over the geological intelligence networks that made those foundings possible. That treated the great American fortunes as the products of individual genius while quietly omitting the ancient infrastructure that those fortunes were built on. Let's now move from the ground to the water again, and from the water to something that connects all of these threads in a way that I want to spend some time with. Let's talk about the ancient American trade networks, and specifically about what those networks tell us about the economic geography that the 19th century fortunes were built on. The pre-Columbian trade networks of North America were, by any reasonable measure, one of the most impressive commercial systems in the ancient world. We know this not because anyone wrote it down in a way that survived to the present, but because of the material evidence, the objects, the raw materials, the finished goods that turn up, in archaeological contexts, hundreds and thousands of miles from where they were produced. Obsidian from the volcanic deposits of Yellowstone turns up in Hopewell Mound contexts in Ohio. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico turn up in archaeological sites in the Great Lakes region. Copper from Lake Superior turns up in ceremonial contexts along the Gulf Coast and in the American Southwest. Mica from the Appalachian Highlands of North Carolina turns up in Hopewell ceremonial sites from Illinois to New York. Marine shells from the Atlantic coast turn up in sites in the interior of the continent that had no direct access to the ocean. The distances involved are staggering. The obsidian cliff in Yellowstone, the primary source of a distinctive volcanic glass that turns up in Hopewell sites across the Midwest, is roughly 1,500 miles from the center of Hopewell territory in the Ohio Valley. For objects made of that obsidian to travel that distance, there had to be a reliable and organized trade network connecting those two regions, not occasional long-distance travel. Regular, organized commercial contact. This is not a disputed fact in archaeology. The Hopewell interaction sphere, as it is called, is one of the most extensively studied phenomena in North American prehistoric archaeology. What is contested, or rather what is consistently minimized in the popular presentation of this material, is the scale and sophistication of the organizational apparatus that must have supported such a trade network. A trade network operating at that geographic scale required infrastructure. It required established routes, reliable transportation, organized logistics, some system of accounting and reciprocity. It required, in other words, many of the same elements that a commercial trading network in any era requires. And the fact that such a network existed in North America 2,000 years ago is a powerful indicator that the landscape of North America, when European contact began, was not the blank economic slate that the founding mythology of American capitalism requires it to be. The landscape had an economic organization. It had roots and nodes and relationships. And those roots and nodes and relationships did not disappear when European contact disrupted the cultures that had built them. They were still there, encoded in the geography, recoverable by anyone who looked carefully enough. And the people who looked most carefully, in the crucial decades of the early to mid-19th century, were the people who built the great American fortunes. Now, I want to introduce another figure who belongs in this story, and who has been almost entirely absent from the popular history of American economic development. His name was Henry Rowe Schoolcraft, and his importance to the story of where the great American fortunes came from is difficult to overstate. Schoolcraft was born in 1,793 inches, Albany County, New York. He trained as a mineralogist and glassmaker, but his career took him west, into the frontier of the American Northwest, where he became an Indian agent for the federal government. He married a woman of Ojibwe descent, Jane Johnston Schoolcraft, who was herself a remarkable figure, one of the first known Native American literary writers in English. Through his marriage and through his years of government service in the Great Lakes region, Schoolcraft accumulated an extraordinary body of knowledge about the Native American cultures of the American interior, about their languages, their oral traditions, their geographic knowledge, and their relationships to the landscape. Between 1,851 and 1,857, Schoolcraft published a massive 6-volume work titled Historical and Statistical Information Respecting the History, Condition and Prospects of the Indian Tribes of the United States. This work, which was funded by the federal government and represented the most comprehensive compilation of information about Native American cultures that had yet been assembled, contained embedded within it an enormous amount of geographic and resource intelligence. Schoolcraft's informants, the Native American consultants whose knowledge formed the basis of much of the work, provided geographic information about the interior of the continent that was, in some respects, more detailed and more accurate than anything available through official government survey. Information about mineral deposits, about water resources, about the characteristics of different regions of the landscape, about the ancient trade routes and their geographic logic. And this information, published by the federal government and circulated through the official channels of American intellectual life, was available to anyone who was looking for it. The financial and geological establishments of the 1850s and 1860s were certainly looking for it. The people who were planning the transcontinental railroad surveys, who were evaluating the potential of the Lake Superior copper deposits, who were assessing the commercial geography of the Mississippi River Valley, had every reason to read Schoolcraft carefully. and the geographic intelligence that Schoolcraft had assembled, translated from the oral traditions and practical knowledge of Native American cultures into the documentary form that European American institutions could access and use, provided exactly the kind of information that would allow well-positioned investors to make decisions that looked, to outside observers, like extraordinary foresight. There is something deeply melancholy about this. The geographic knowledge that Schoolcraft compiled, the centuries of accumulated practical understanding about the North American landscape that he translated into a form accessible to the institutions of European American civilization, was used by those institutions to consolidate control over the very resources that the knowledge described. The people whose knowledge it was, whose ancestors had accumulated it through thousands of years of careful observation and practical experimentation, did not benefit from its translation. They were, in the decades that followed the publication of Schoolcraft's work, progressively dispossessed of the territories that the knowledge described. The translation of their geographic intelligence into the financial intelligence of the emerging American investment establishment was, in effect, another form of dispossession. But let's press further into the financial architecture of the great fortunes, because there is something about the structure of the capital that built them that has not been fully examined. Let's talk about the banks. And let's talk about something specific about those banks that the standard histories of American finance consistently underemphasize. The great American fortunes of the 19th century were not built with American capital, not primarily. They were built with European capital, specifically with British and Dutch capital that flowed into the United States through a financial infrastructure that was older, more sophisticated, and more deliberately organized than the popular history of American capitalism acknowledges. The Baring Brothers banking house, which was based in London, had been involved in American finance since before the founding of the Republic. The Barings financed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the transaction that effectively doubled the size of the United States, and that set the stage for a century of westward expansion. The geographic knowledge that Barings brought to that transaction about what the Louisiana Territory actually contained and what it was worth was not the geographic knowledge of the frontier. It was the geographic knowledge of a financial institution that had been gathering intelligence about North American resources for decades through its relationships with the French colonial administration, with the fur trade networks, and with the Spanish colonial authorities in the southern and western portions of the continent. The connection between Baring Brothers and the emerging American financial establishment was not informal or incidental. It was structural. American banks routinely drew on Baring credit facilities. American states borrowed from Baring Brothers for infrastructure financing. American railroad companies used Baring Brothers as their primary agent for raising capital in European markets. And the intelligence that flowed back and forth through these financial relationships included geographic and resource intelligence of exactly the kind that allowed well-positioned American investors to make decisions that looked like genius but were actually the product of access to information. The Rothschild banking family, which was perhaps even more deeply embedded in the infrastructure of 19th century global finance than the Barings, had American connections that are, in the standard histories of American capitalism, consistently described as peripheral. In fact, they were central. The Rothschilds, through their American agent, August Belmont, who served as the American representative of the Rothschild interests from the 1840s onward, had direct financial relationships with many of the emerging American fortunes. Belmont was not just a banker. He was a political operative, a social figure, and an intelligence gatherer of the first order. His reports to the Rothschild family in London were, among other things, geographic and resource assessments of the American economic frontier. And the geographic intelligence that flowed through the Rothschild-Belmont network informed investment decisions by European capital that shaped the American economic landscape. The Rothschilds were not passive investors waiting for American entrepreneurs to identify opportunities. They were active participants in the process of identifying those opportunities, and the tools they used for that identification included some of the most sophisticated geographic and geological intelligence networks operating in the mid-19th century world. The connection between these European financial networks and the ancient geographic knowledge of North America is not direct. It does not work through a simple chain of transmission in which specific pieces of information traveled from Native American oral traditions through European American intermediaries to the desks of London bankers. It works through the broader patterns of geographic intelligence that shaped the investment decisions of the mid-19th century. The European banking houses knew, through their involvement in the fur trade, in colonial land speculation, and in the broader commerce of the North American frontier, that the landscape of North America contained resources of extraordinary richness. They knew that the geography of that landscape had been thoroughly understood by its original inhabitants, and they used that knowledge, through their American networks, to position capital in the places that would generate the greatest returns. The great American fortunes were, in this sense, the product of a collaboration between Old World financial sophistication and New World geographic intelligence. The Old World provided the capital and the organizational technology of advanced finance. The New World provided the resources, and the translation between those two elements was performed by the men whose names we remember as the founders of American industrial capitalism. They were not pioneers in the sense of going where no one had gone before. They were translators. Translators who could read the ancient economic geography of North America and convert it into the language of European finance. Now, let's go somewhere genuinely unexpected with this story. Let's talk about the mounds again, but this time, let's talk about what was in them. Not what the archaeologists found when they excavated them in the 19th century, which is what usually gets discussed. Let's talk about what the documentary record suggests was taken from them before the archaeologists arrived. The systematic looting of Native American mound sites in the eastern United States began almost as soon as European American settlement reached them. Farmers digging into mounds for the fertile earth of their fills found copper ornaments, mica sheets, shell beads, ceramic vessels, and occasionally objects of great beauty and evident commercial value. These objects entered private collections, the emerging market for antiquities, and in some cases, the hands of people with very specific commercial interests. The copper objects are the most significant for our purposes. The copper sheets and ornaments found in Hopewell and Mississippian burial contexts were not manufactured copper in the modern sense. They were not cast or smelted. They were made from native copper, hammered cold into sheets and then worked into elaborate forms. The quality of the copper was extraordinarily high, approaching or equaling the purity of modern refined copper. And the manufacturing techniques, while different from European metalworking tradition, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the physical properties of the material. Some of these copper objects were genuinely enormous. Large repousse copper plates from Mississippian sites depicting human figures in elaborate ceremonial dress measured several feet in length and showed a level of artistic and technical sophistication that was, to anyone who saw them without preconceptions, clearly the product of a mature and highly developed artistic tradition. These objects were not primitive. They were the products of a civilization, and they were collected systematically and extensively in the period from roughly 1800 to 1880. They were collected by a community of what we might call archaeological entrepreneurs, people who organized systematic excavations of mound sites, sold or traded the objects they found, and compiled documentation that entered the private records of American antiquarianism. That documentation, which included not just descriptions of the objects, but accounts of the sites where they were found and the contexts in which they appeared, represented a body of geographic and archaeological intelligence about the distribution of pre-Columbian activity in North America. And some of that intelligence, through networks that connected the antiquarian community to the investment establishment, contributed to the broader geographic intelligence base on which the great American fortunes were built. This is a claim that requires some unpacking. What I am suggesting is not that investors were making decisions based on the contents of ancient burial mounds in some direct or mystical sense. What I am suggesting is that the community of people engaged in the systematic collection and study of pre-Columbian American objects in the first half of the 19th century overlapped significantly with the community of people engaged in the geographic and geological assessment of American resources, and that the geographic intelligence produced by both communities fed into the investment decisions of the emerging American financial establishment. The specific connection point is the concept of what 19th century Americans called improvement. The idea that the American landscape could be rendered more productive and more valuable through systematic investment and development was central to the economic ideology of the era. And the people who were most interested in the archaeology of pre-Columbian North America were, in many cases, precisely the people who were most enthusiastic about the improvement program, because the archaeology demonstrated something important to them. It demonstrated that the North American landscape was not an empty wilderness waiting to be developed from scratch. It was a landscape that had already been developed, that had already been organized and exploited, and that therefore was recoverable rather than original. The development work did not need to start at zero. It could build on what was already there. This framing, which justified the rapid and systematic exploitation of American natural and geographic resources as a continuation rather than a beginning, was enormously useful to the people who were organizing the capital for that exploitation. And the archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian development, which was being assembled precisely during the decades when the foundational investments of the great American fortunes were being made, provided the intellectual framework for that justification. Now let's turn to the steel industry and to the specific geography of its raw materials, because there is a story buried in the geography of American steel that connects everything we have been discussing. The American steel industry, which was the foundation of the Carnegie fortune and the keystone of the Morgan financial empire at the dawn of the 20th century, depended on the combination of two specific raw materials: iron ore from the Lake Superior region and coking coal from the Appalachian coal fields of western Pennsylvania and West Virginia. The geographic relationship between these two raw material sources and the manufacturing centers of Pittsburgh and the Ohio Valley was not accidental. It was the product of a specific geographic logic that had been understood in its broad outlines long before the first modern steel mill was built. The Appalachian coalfields of western Pennsylvania were not undiscovered in the first half of the 19th century. Coal outcrops in that region had been noted by colonial-era observers, and the commercial potential of the deposits was discussed in the geological literature as early as the 1820s. The specific coal seams that would prove most valuable for metallurgical coking were identified in early geological surveys conducted in the 1830s and 1840s. The question is not whether the coal was known to exist. It is who knew about it, in what detail, and when. And the answer to that question, when you trace the documentary record carefully, points consistently to the same networks of geological, military, and financial intelligence that we have been tracking throughout this story. The Appalachian region, which includes the coalfields of western Pennsylvania, was one of the most intensively traveled and studied regions of pre-Columbian North America. The major cultural traditions of the region, from the Adena culture of the early period to the later Iroquoian and Algonquian traditions of the historical period, had all maintained significant presence in the coal country. The ancient trade routes of the region passed through the coalfield areas. The major river systems of the region, the Monongahela, the Euphiogheny, the Cheat, and their tributaries, were established corridors of indigenous commerce that became, in the colonial and early national period, corridors of European-American commerce. And the people who knew those corridors best, who had traveled them most extensively, and who had accumulated the most detailed geographic knowledge of them, were the people connected to the fur trade networks and the military establishments of the frontier. The same networks that we have been tracking as the conduits of geographic intelligence about resources in other parts of the continent. Andrew Carnegie arrived in Pittsburgh in 1848 as a child immigrant from Scotland. He worked his way up through the railroad industry, acquiring knowledge and connections that positioned him perfectly to move into steel manufacturing in the 1870s. His access to the specific information about raw material sources, transportation logistics, and market structure that allowed him to build Carnegie Steel into the dominant force in the American steel industry was the product of those connections. And those connections were embedded in networks of geographic and commercial intelligence that went back much further than Carnegie's own career. The story of Carnegie Steel is presented in popular culture as the ultimate immigrant success story. The poor Scottish boy who came to America with nothing and built the greatest steel company in the world through intelligence and hard work. And the human story of Carnegie's ambition and discipline is real, but the infrastructure of information and access on which that ambition was built is not the blank slate that the mythologized version of the story requires. Carnegie had access to information about raw material sources, about transportation logistics, about market conditions and financial structures. And some of that access derived from sources that go much deeper into the American past than his biography suggests. The geographic logic of the American steel industry, the specific configuration of iron ore from the Lake Superior region combined with coking coal from the Appalachian region, and manufacturing facilities in the Ohio Valley, was not invented by Carnegie or his contemporaries. It was discovered. Discovered in the sense that it was identified as an economic configuration that could be made to work at industrial scale. But the geographic relationships that made it work, the proximity of the ore, the coal, and the transportation infrastructure, those relationships had been there for a very long time. They had been known, in different terms and for different purposes, by the people who had lived in and around those landscapes for thousands of years. And the people who figured out how to translate that ancient geographic knowledge into industrial capital were the people whose names are now associated with the founding of American industrial capitalism. They were not, in the deepest sense, founders. They were converters. They converted an ancient geographic understanding of the North American landscape into the financial architecture of the modern American economy. Let's bring this story to a place that I think will resonate in a different way. Let's talk about what happened to the people whose knowledge made all of this possible. The decades between 1840 and 1890, which were the decades in which the great American fortunes were being built, were also the decades of the most intense dispossession of Native American communities in American history. The removal policies of the 1830s, which had forced the eastern tribes west of the Mississippi, gave way to the reservation policies of the mid-century period, which confined what remained of Native American economic and political life to a shrinking set of territories. The homestead policies that distributed western land to individual settlers, and the railroad land grant policies that transferred enormous tracts of public land to private railroad companies, collectively reduced the land base of Native American communities from the entirety of the continent to a fraction of a percent of its surface area within the span of a single generation. This dispossession was not separate from the fortune-building story. It was part of it. The land that became the railroad's land grants had to come from somewhere. The territories that were open to mining and settlement had to be obtained from someone. The geographic intelligence that informed the investment decisions of the emerging American financial elite had to be gathered from somewhere. And in every case, the somewhere and the someone were the Native American communities whose presence on and knowledge of the American landscape was the foundation on which the great American fortunes were built. This is not a comfortable thing to say. It is not the story of American capitalism that celebrates the dynamism and ingenuity of the great entrepreneurs, but it is a part of the story that is essential to understanding why those entrepreneurs were able to do what they did when they did it. The resources were already identified. The routes were already mapped. The geographic logic was already worked out. What the great American fortunes added was the organizational and financial technology to convert that ancient geographic intelligence into industrial capital at a scale and speed that the world had never seen. And the people who provided the geographic intelligence, who had accumulated it over thousands of years of careful observation and practical experimentation, received almost nothing in return. Their knowledge was taken, their lands were taken, their communities were disrupted, dismantled, and in some cases destroyed, and the fortunes that were built on what was taken from them became the foundation of the modern American economy. This is a history that America has never fully reckoned with, and it is a history that is directly relevant to the question we started with. Why did the great American fortunes appear so suddenly, in such an extraordinarily short period of time, in the middle of the 19th century? The answer, at least in significant part, is that the infrastructure on which those fortunes were built was not built in the 19th century. It was built over the preceding millennia by the cultures that preceded European contact, and the translation of that ancient infrastructure into modern capital was accomplished with a speed that seemed miraculous, precisely because it was building on a foundation that already existed. The miracle was not creation. The miracle was conversion. Now I want to take us somewhere that is going to feel different from everything we have discussed so far. I want to talk about some specific physical evidence, about things that exist in the world, documented and measurable, that tell a story about the pre-Columbian economic geography of North America that the official historical narrative has never adequately incorporated. Let's start in Illinois. About 50 miles east of St. Louis, on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River, there is a site called Cahokia. We have mentioned it briefly, but let's spend more time with it, because Cahokia contains physical evidence that, if it existed anywhere else on Earth, would be the subject of intense and sustained scholarly and popular attention. Because it exists in the American Midwest, it has been studied carefully by specialists, but has never entered the broader historical consciousness in the way it deserves. At its peak, around the year 1100 CE, Cahokia was a city, a real city. Not a large village or a ceremonial center in the limited sense, sometimes implied by archaeological terminology. A city of somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 inhabitants, with a formal urban layout, a monumental architecture program, an administrative hierarchy, a specialized economy, and connections to a trade network that extended across much of North America. The central monument of Cahokia, Monk's Mound, is the largest prehistoric earthwork structure in North America. It is larger, in total volume of earth moved, than the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan in Mexico. It is 4 terraced levels tall, covering an area of roughly 14 acres at its base. Building it required moving an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth, a project that, by any reasonable estimate, required decades of organized labor and a sophisticated administrative apparatus capable of coordinating the efforts of thousands of workers over an extended period. Monk's Mound was not the only mound at Cahokia. The site included over 100 individual mound structures, arranged around a central plaza that covered roughly 40 acres. The entire complex was enclosed by a wooden palisade wall with observation towers, a defensive structure whose construction required an estimated 20,000 individual timber posts. The city was laid out according to a formal plan, with the central plaza oriented to the cardinal directions and the major structures positioned according to what appears to have been an astronomical alignment system. This was not a primitive settlement. This was a sophisticated urban center, the product of a civilization that understood architecture, engineering, urban planning, administrative organization, and astronomical observation at a level that, in 1100 CE, matched or exceeded what was occurring in many parts of Europe, and it was located at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, at the precise geographic point that would, 800 years later, become the site of St. Louis. At the precise geographic point that was identified by the Mississippian civilization as one of the most strategically important locations in the interior of North America. At the precise geographic point through which the commercial expansion of the United States into the interior of the continent would flow. This was not coincidence. The people who established the city at Cahokia understood the geographic significance of that location. They understood that it sat at the convergence of major river systems, that it commanded the approaches to the agricultural heartland of the continent, that it was positioned to control commerce moving up and down the Mississippi and in and out of the Missouri River drainage. And the European-American civilization that established St. Louis at the same location understood those same things. The geographic logic was not invented in the 19th century. It was rediscovered, and the rediscoverers built their fortunes on the infrastructure of the discovery. Now, let's go to the Ohio Valley. Let's go to the specific geography of Hopewell culture and ask what it was about that particular landscape that supported one of the most elaborate and geographically extensive cultural systems in the ancient world. The Ohio Valley was the heartland of Hopewell culture not because it was a particularly hospitable or pleasant place to live, though it was certainly that. It was the heartland because it was the intersection of 4 major ecological zones. To the north, the Great Lakes, with their extraordinary aquatic resources and their connection to the copper-bearing regions of Lake Superior. To the south, the Ohio River drainage, which connected the region to the Mississippi River system and to the broad agricultural potential of the central continent. To the east, the Appalachian Highlands, with their mineral resources and their role as the watershed between the Ohio Valley and the Atlantic coastal plain. To the west, the beginning of the continental interior, the grasslands and river systems that would eventually connect, through trade, to the cultures of the Great Plains and the Southwest. This intersection of ecological zones made the Ohio Valley a natural hub for a continental trade network, and the Hopewell people exploited that geographic logic brilliantly, building a network of exchange relationships that brought materials and objects from across the continent to their ceremonial centers, and that distributed, in return, their own distinctive material culture across an enormous geographic area. The Ohio Valley was still an economic hub 2,000 years later. It was the site of the first major industrial cities of the American interior: Cincinnati, Columbus, Pittsburgh, Cleveland. These were the first large cities of the American Midwest, and they were located where they were, not because 19th century urban planners were particularly inspired, but because the geographic logic that had made the Ohio Valley the center of a continental trade network 2,000 years earlier still applied. The rivers were still there, the ecological zones were still there, the transportation logic was still there. The 19th century built its cities on the same geographic foundation that the Hopewell builders had identified millennia earlier. And the fortunes that were built on those cities, the industrial fortunes of Ohio and western Pennsylvania and the emerging Midwest, were built on a geographic foundation that was ancient, not new, not the product of pioneering vision. Ancient. The pioneers were pioneers in the sense that they were new to that landscape. But the landscape itself was not new to economic organization. It had been economically organized before, deeply and sophisticatedly organized, and the people who understood that, who could read the ancient organization in the geographic record, were the people who built the modern fortunes. Let me now turn to something that is more speculative but that I think is important to raise, because there is a possibility embedded in this history that goes beyond the question of geographic intelligence and investment advantage. It is a possibility that touches on something more fundamental about the nature of the American economic miracle. What if the speed and scale of American industrial development in the 19th century was not purely the product of European capital and technology applied to an undeveloped landscape? What if some portion of that development, particularly in the areas of mining, metallurgy, and materials processing, was building on a foundation of practical knowledge that was much older than the European Industrial Revolution? This is not a question about lost civilizations in the science fiction sense. It is a question about the transmission of practical knowledge, about the way that the accumulated practical understanding of a culture can persist in the landscape, in the material record, and in the oral traditions of successor communities, even after the formal institutional structures of the original culture have dissolved. The pre-Columbian copper mining operations of the Lake Superior region, which we have already discussed, were not just an example of ancient resource extraction at scale. They were evidence of a metallurgical tradition that had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying, extracting, and processing copper over thousands of years. Those techniques did not entirely disappear when the formal copper trade of the Hopewell period declined. They persisted, in modified forms, in the practical knowledge of the communities that continued to live in and around the Lake Superior copper country. When American mining companies entered the Lake Superior copper region in the 1840s and 1850s, they brought European mining technology with them, but they also encountered, on the ground, traces of ancient practice. The location of the richest deposits had been marked, in effect, by the presence of ancient mining pits. The techniques for working native copper, for shaping it cold without smelting, were still known to some degree to the Ojibwe communities who had maintained continuous presence in the region, and some of the early American mining operators drew on that practical knowledge in developing their own operations. This is speculative in the sense that the documentation is sparse. The American mining establishment of the 19th century did not, as a general rule, acknowledge its debts to indigenous knowledge. The mythology of pioneering discovery was too important to the legitimacy of the enterprise to allow for acknowledgement of what had already been known. But the sparse documentation that does exist, in the field reports of early mining operators, in the memoirs of frontier officials, in the correspondence of the geological surveyors, suggests that the practical knowledge of indigenous communities was used, informally and without acknowledgement, in the development of some of the most important mineral operations of the 19th century. And if that is true for the copper operations of Lake Superior, it is at least possible that something similar was true for other resource industries, for the iron operations of the Mesabi Range, for the coal operations of Appalachia, for the oil operations of western Pennsylvania and western New York, for the timber operations of the Great Lakes region. In each of these cases, the ancient inhabitants of the landscape had centuries or millennia of practical knowledge about the resources in question. And in each of these cases, the commercial development of those resources began with the displacement of those inhabitants and the appropriation of the territories they had occupied. But displacement does not necessarily mean the complete loss of the knowledge that the displaced community carried. Practical knowledge, the kind of knowledge that is encoded in technique and habit rather than in written text, persists through channels that are not always visible to official history. It persists in the memory of individuals who move between communities. It persists in the practical adaptations of successor communities who work the same landscape. It persists in the physical traces left in that landscape by earlier practice. And it is possible, though difficult to document precisely, that some of what made American industrial development so extraordinarily rapid in the 19th century was precisely this kind of persistence. That the industries that were building the great American fortunes were not starting from zero in their understanding of the resources they were developing. That they were, consciously or unconsciously, building on a foundation of accumulated practical knowledge that was much older than the European Industrial Revolution. That the American industrial miracle was, in part, an ancient North American inheritance. This is a history that the mythology of American capitalism cannot easily accommodate. It cannot accommodate it because it complicates the story in too many directions simultaneously. It complicates the story of individual genius and entrepreneurial vision. It complicates the story of European civilization bringing development to an undeveloped land. And it complicates the story of the dispossession of indigenous communities as a necessary and regrettable consequence of progress, by suggesting that that dispossession was not just a moral wrong but an economic theft, a theft of knowledge as well as land. Let's come back to the families themselves. And let's ask the question that I think this entire history has been building toward. What did they know, and when did they know it? I do not think that Rockefeller or Vanderbilt or Carnegie or Morgan had conscious access to a coherent understanding of the ancient geographic and economic legacy of pre-Columbian North America. I do not think they sat in private rooms and discussed the Hopewell interaction sphere or the ancient copper mines of Lake Superior in terms that would be recognizable to a modern archaeologist. The knowledge did not work that way. But I do think that they operated within networks of geographic and commercial intelligence that incorporated, in ways that were often informal and not fully articulated, the accumulated geographic knowledge of the North American landscape that was the legacy of its pre-Columbian inhabitants. I think that this knowledge, transmitted through the fur trade networks, through the geological survey literature, through the ethnological research of figures like Gallatin and Schoolcraft, through the practical experience of frontier agents and military surveyors, gave the emerging American financial elite an understanding of the landscape that was qualitatively different from and superior to what was available through official channels alone. And I think that this advantage, this access to a deeper and older understanding of what the North American landscape contained and how it had been organized, was one of the most important factors in the extraordinary speed and scale of the fortune building that occurred in the middle decades of the 19th century. The great American fortunes did not come from nowhere. They came from somewhere very specific. They came from a landscape that had been inhabited, organized, and economically developed for thousands of years before the first European settler arrived. They came from the translated capital of an ancient civilization whose existence the official history of American capitalism has consistently minimized. And they were built by people who had access to a map of that ancient capital that the rest of the country did not know existed. This is not a comfortable history, but it is a real one. And the more carefully you look at the documentary record, the more clearly that reality comes into focus. Now let's spend some time with the Morgan story specifically, because the Morgan family's path to financial dominance contains something that none of the other great fortune stories contains in quite the same form. It contains a direct and documented connection to the pre-Civil War financial establishment that, when traced carefully, leads back to a set of relationships that illuminate the deeper infrastructure of American capital in ways that the standard histories of J.P. Morgan's career do not. John Pierpont. Morgan was born in 1,837 inches, Hartford, Connecticut. His father was Junius Spencer Morgan, who was himself a banker of considerable standing and who was, from the late 1850s onward, a partner in the London banking house of George Peabody. George Peabody was an American-born merchant and financier who had established himself in London in the 1830s and had built what was, by the 1850s, one of the most important intermediary banking operations connecting American commercial interests with the London capital market. Peabody's firm, and the Morgan firm that succeeded it, occupied a specific and extremely important position in the financial architecture of mid-19th century capitalism. They were the bridge between Old World capital and New World opportunity. They matched European investors, primarily British but also continental, with American investment opportunities, taking a commission on the capital flows they facilitated, and building relationships on both sides of the Atlantic that gave them unparalleled access to information about where capital was flowing and where it was needed. This position gave Junius Morgan and his son J.P. Morgan something that no other American financial institution had: simultaneous access to the deepest sources of European capital and the most current intelligence about American investment conditions. And because the European capital market, particularly the London market, was already deeply embedded in the global intelligence networks of the British Empire, the Morgans' London connections gave them access to geographic and commercial intelligence about North America that went beyond what was available through American sources alone. The British Empire, in the middle decades of the 19th century, had a global intelligence apparatus of extraordinary scope and sophistication. The combination of the British military, the diplomatic service, the commercial networks of the East India Company and its successors, and the financial networks of the City of London gave the British establishment a view of the world's resources and commercial geography that was, at the time, unmatched by any other institution. And the American banking houses that were embedded in the London financial establishment, as the Morgan firm most prominently was, had access to that view. This is important because it means that the investment decisions made by J.P. Morgan and the financial networks he organized were informed by a geographic intelligence that was not purely American in origin. It was global. It was the intelligence of an empire that had been mapping and assessing the resources of North America since the earliest period of European contact. It was the accumulated knowledge of 2 centuries of British colonial and commercial engagement with the North American landscape. And that knowledge, filtered through the Morgan firm's position as the bridge between London capital and American opportunity, shaped the investment patterns that built the Morgan financial empire, and that, through Morgan's role as the organizer of American capital, shaped the entire structure of American industrial finance at the turn of the 20th century. The formation of United States Steel in 1901, which was Morgan's greatest organizational achievement, combined Carnegie's steel operations with Rockefeller's Mesabi Range iron ore holdings, and with a collection of other steel and iron properties that Morgan had been accumulating for years. The geographic logic of that combination, which brought together iron ore from Lake Superior, coking coal from the Appalachian region, and steel-making facilities in the Ohio Valley, was the same geographic logic that we have been tracing throughout this entire story. It was the logic of the ancient continental trade network, of the Hopewell interaction sphere, of the Mississippian commercial geography, translated into the financial architecture of industrial capitalism. Morgan saw it, or more precisely, Morgan had access to an intelligence network that allowed him to see what the geographic logic of American resource extraction implied at industrial scale, and he organized the capital to realize that logic. The result was the largest corporation in the history of the world at that time, a company valued at over $1 billion in 1901, a figure that represented something like 60% of the entire gross domestic product of the United States. That is an extraordinary concentration of economic power, and it was built, as we have traced, on a foundation that is much older and much more complicated than the standard history of American capitalism acknowledges. It was built on ancient geographic knowledge, on the infrastructure of ancient trade networks, on the practical inheritance of cultures that had organized the economic geography of North America for thousands of years before the first European ship crossed the Atlantic, and the people who built those great fortunes, who converted that ancient inheritance into modern capital at a speed and scale that the world had never seen, did so through a combination of genuine organizational genius, access to financial infrastructure that was unavailable to most Americans, and access to geographic intelligence that derived from sources that the official history of American economic development has never fully accounted for. This is the story of where the great American fortunes came from. Not from nothing, not from pure genius and hard work applied to an empty landscape, from something, from a landscape that was already rich, already organized, already known, from the converted capital of an ancient inheritance, from the geographic intelligence of 1,000 years of North American civilization that was systematically translated in the middle decades of the 19th century into the financial capital of the modern American economy. And that translation, that conversion, that remarkable and troubling alchemy is what we call the Gilded Age. Now, let's follow this story into territory that is less well documented, but that, I think, reveals something important about the deeper architecture of American wealth. Let's talk about the families that did not make it into the standard histories of the Gilded Age. The families whose wealth was less visible, whose operations were more carefully hidden, and whose connections to the ancient geographic inheritance of North America were more direct and more deliberate than anything we have discussed so far. Because for every Rockefeller or Carnegie or Morgan whose wealth building is extensively documented even if imperfectly understood, there were dozens of other family operations, smaller in absolute scale but sometimes more revealing in their methods, that participated in the same fundamental process of translating ancient geographic capital into modern financial capital. And some of those operations left traces in the historical record that illuminate the process in ways that the great Gilded Age stories do not. Let me tell you about a category of family that I think of as the geological aristocracy. These were families whose wealth was built on specific mineral deposits. Not through the industrial scale operations of a Rockefeller or a Carnegie, but through the ownership and controlled development of specific geologically rich properties. Coal families in western Pennsylvania, salt families in the Syracuse region of New York, lead families in the Galena district of northwestern Illinois, iron families in the bog iron regions of New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania, stone families in the limestone districts of Indiana and Ohio. These families, in many cases, built fortunes that, while smaller than the great Gilded Age titans were, in terms of their relationship to the local economies of their regions, enormously powerful. And the pattern of how they acquired their initial mineral properties is, across a remarkable number of cases, essentially the same. They acquired the properties before the properties were known to be valuable, before the specific geological knowledge that would eventually justify the acquisition was part of the public record, before the infrastructure that would make extraction economically feasible was built. And, in case after case, when you trace back the source of their information, you find the same kinds of connections that we have been tracing throughout this story. Connections to the geological survey networks, connections to the military and frontier establishment, connections to the fur trade and the land agency business, and, in some cases, connections to the oral traditions and practical knowledge of the indigenous communities that had been removed from the territories in question. The salt families of central New York are a particularly clear example. The Onondaga salt licks, which were the source of essentially all the salt consumed east of the Appalachians in the colonial and early national period, had been known to Europeans since the 17th century because they were known to the Iroquois. The Onondaga people, who were the keepers of the Iroquois Confederacy's sacred fire and who occupied the central geographic position in the Confederacy's territory, had been using and trading Onondaga salt for generations before European contact. The salt licks were part of their economic and ceremonial life. When European-American interests began to develop the Onondaga salt deposits commercially in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the families that established controlling positions in that industry did so using information that had come, directly or indirectly, from the Iroquois knowledge base. The locations of the most productive salt springs, the seasonal variations in brine concentration, the best methods for extracting and processing the salt, these were things that the Iroquois had understood through generations of practical experience. And that understanding was accessed by the families that built the Onondaga salt industry through the channels of frontier commerce and indigenous colonial relationship that characterized the contact zone of the northeastern United States. The Onondaga salt industry was not one of the great Gilded Age fortunes, but it was the foundation of the economic dominance of the Syracuse region of New York, and it contributed to the broader economic geography of the northeastern United States in ways that influenced the larger fortune-building story. The salt that came from Onondaga went into the preservation of food that was shipped along the Erie Canal. The wealth that accumulated in the salt industry supported the investment in the broader infrastructure of New York commerce, and the families that controlled that wealth were embedded in the same networks of political connection, geographic intelligence, and capital access that we have been tracing throughout this story. The lead families of northwestern Illinois tell a similar story. The Galena lead district, which was the most productive lead mining region in North America in the first half of the 19th century, had been known as a lead source to the Native American communities of the region for a very long time. The lead deposits of the Galena area were mined by indigenous people for centuries before European contact, primarily for use in the manufacture of lead-based pigments and for trade with communities that needed lead for ceremonial purposes. French fur traders encountered lead operations in the Galena district in the early 18th century and began limited commercial extraction. By the 1820s, when American commercial mining began to develop the Galena district seriously, the families that established controlling positions in the industry did so on the basis of geographic knowledge that was, once again, significantly derived from the accumulated practical knowledge of the communities that had been working those deposits for generations. The most productive areas of the Galena lead field were not discovered through fresh geological survey. They were identified on the basis of the traces left by earlier extraction by the indigenous mining operations that had preceded European contact. The families that built fortunes in the Galena lead district, families with names like Grasho and Chuto and Dodge, were in many cases deeply embedded in the fur trade and frontier commerce networks that connected American commercial life to the indigenous knowledge base of the interior. And their positioning in the Galena lead district reflected that connection. They knew where the lead was, not because they had discovered it, because they had learned it from sources that the official history of American mining does not acknowledge. Now, I want to bring this story into a slightly different register. Because we have been talking primarily about geographic and geological intelligence, about the knowledge of where resources were located and how to access them. But there is another form of intelligence that contributed to the great American fortunes, and that form is even more directly connected to the pre-Columbian heritage of North America. It is the intelligence of systems, of organizational systems, of the ways in which complex economic operations can be structured and coordinated across large geographic areas. The Hopewell and Mississippian cultures were not just resource extractors, they were commercial organizers of extraordinary sophistication. The Hopewell interaction sphere, the continental trade network that distributed materials from the Lake Superior copper mines to the Gulf Coast shell beds to the Appalachian mica deposits across a geographic area of millions of square miles, was a logistics achievement that required, among other things, a system for organizing reciprocal exchange across communities that had no shared political or administrative structure, that spoke many different languages, and that were separated by enormous distances. How did they do it? The archaeological evidence suggests several mechanisms. There were ceremonial exchange relationships, in which goods moved between communities as part of a framework of reciprocal obligation and symbolic communication. There were specialist traders, individuals, or groups that maintained relationships with multiple communities and facilitated exchange between them. There were established waypoints, locations where exchanges could be conducted, where travelers could resupply, and where commercial disputes could be adjudicated according to shared norms. This was a commercial system. Not a market economy in the modern sense, but a system for organizing and facilitating the exchange of goods and services across enormous distances and between communities with very different cultural frameworks. And the organizational logic of that system, the ways in which it structured relationships of obligation and reciprocity, the ways in which it used geographic waypoints to reduce transaction costs, the ways in which it maintained the smooth operation of exchange through ceremonial and symbolic frameworks, these organizational insights did not disappear when the formal Hopewell Exchange network declined. They persisted, in modified forms, in the commercial practices of the successor cultures, and they were encountered by European and European-American traders who entered the interior of North America as a pre-existing commercial logic that could be adapted and exploited. The fur trade, which was the first major European-American commercial enterprise in the North American interior, operated in large part by plugging into the pre-existing trade network infrastructure of the indigenous cultures it encountered. The fur trade used indigenous trade routes as transportation infrastructure. It used indigenous trade relationships as the basis for its commercial networks. It used indigenous value systems and exchange norms as the framework within which it conducted business. The great fur trade companies, the Hudson's Bay Company, the Northwest Company, the American Fur Company, were not creating commercial infrastructure from scratch. They were converting existing commercial infrastructure to their own purposes. And the organizational lessons they learned in the process about how to manage commercial relationships across vast geographic areas, about how to maintain supply chains that extended thousands of miles through difficult terrain, about how to adjudicate disputes and maintain the stability of exchange relationships in the absence of formal legal institutions. These lessons were part of the knowledge base on which the more formal commercial and industrial organizations of the 19th century were built. When John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company was at its peak in the 1820s and 1830s, it was arguably the most sophisticated commercial organization in North America. It operated across a geographic area that dwarfed most European nation-states. It managed supply chains of extraordinary complexity. It maintained commercial relationships with hundreds of indigenous communities, with dozens of European-American outposts, and with the major commercial centers of the Atlantic coast and Europe. And the organizational techniques that made all of this possible were, in significant part, adaptations of the commercial logic that the indigenous communities of North America had developed over thousands of years of continental trade. When Astor converted his fortune from the fur trade into Manhattan real estate in the early 19th century, he brought with him not just capital, but a set of organizational habits and commercial instincts that had been shaped by his engagement with the pre-existing commercial infrastructure of the North American interior. His ability to manage complex multi-party relationships across large geographic areas, to maintain information networks that gave him current intelligence about conditions in distant markets, to structure commercial agreements that would hold over long time periods in the absence of formal legal enforcement mechanisms. These were skills that he had developed in the fur trade, and they were skills that derived, at least in part, from his engagement with a commercial tradition that was much older than the European market economy. This is one of the more subtle and difficult to document aspects of the story I have been telling, but I think it is important. Because the great American fortunes were built not just on geographic knowledge, but on organizational knowledge, on the knowledge of how to structure commercial relationships, how to manage information flows, how to coordinate complex operations across large geographic areas and diverse institutional contexts. And some of that organizational knowledge had roots in the pre-Columbian commercial tradition of North America. The history of capitalism in America tends to treat organizational innovation as if it were invented fresh by each new generation of entrepreneurs. But organizational knowledge, like geographic knowledge, accumulates over time. It is transmitted through commercial practice, through the habits and instincts of people who operate within established commercial frameworks. And the commercial frameworks within which the founders of the great American fortunes operated were not purely European in their character. They had been shaped, in ways that are not always easy to document but that are real, by engagement with commercial traditions that were North American in origin. Let me now bring this story toward what I hope will feel like something of a conclusion, though the truth is that a story this deep and this complex does not have a clean conclusion. What it has are layers of understanding that accumulate as you go deeper into the historical record. The great American fortunes that appeared in the middle decades of the 19th century and that shaped the economic and political character of the modern United States were built on a foundation that is much older and much more complex than the standard history of American capitalism acknowledges. That foundation included the geographic intelligence of the pre-Columbian inhabitants of North America, translated into the financial intelligence of the emerging American investment establishment through a series of intermediary institutions and relationships. It included the physical infrastructure of ancient trade networks and transportation systems, which provided the geographic logic along which modern commercial and industrial development flowed. It included the resource knowledge of communities that had been working the mineral deposits of North America for thousands of years before commercial mining in the European sense began. And it included, in ways that are harder to document but that are no less real, the organizational knowledge of continental commercial systems that had been managing exchange across vast geographic areas for millennia. The men whose names are associated with those fortunes were, in many cases, genuine organizational geniuses. Their ability to mobilize capital, to structure complex commercial relationships, to anticipate the direction of economic development was real and remarkable. But they were not operating in the vacuum that the mythology of American capitalism tends to imply. They were operating in a landscape that was already economically organized, already rich with centuries of accumulated knowledge about its resources and their exploitation, already mapped and understood by the people who had lived in it for far longer than the European-American civilization that was displacing them. And the wealth they built, the extraordinary fortunes that made them the most powerful economic forces the world had ever seen, was built in significant part on the converted capital of that ancient inheritance. The inheritance of a civilization, or series of civilizations, whose sophistication and whose legacy the official history of North America has consistently understated. This is why the question we began with, why the great American fortunes appeared so suddenly and so completely out of nowhere, does not have a satisfying answer within the conventional framework of American historical narrative. Because within that framework, the answer requires the premise that the landscape of North America was an economic blank slate before European-American settlement began, and it was not. It was a landscape with deep economic organization, rich resource knowledge, and sophisticated commercial infrastructure. The blank slate is a fiction, and the fiction has served, among other things, to obscure the ancient foundation on which the modern American economy was built. That foundation is still there. In the geography of American cities, which follow the same river systems and geographic corridors that the ancient cultures used. In the routes of American railroads, which trace the ancient trail systems of North American commerce. In the locations of American industry, which concentrate in the same resource-rich areas that were identified and worked by the pre-Columbian cultures of the continent. And in the distribution of American wealth, which reflects, in its deepest structure, the geography of the ancient North American economic organization that the great fortunes of the 19th century converted into modern capital. The story of where the great American fortunes came from is, at its deepest level, the story of a conversion of ancient North American capital into modern European American capital, a conversion that was accomplished through a combination of commercial intelligence, financial power, and the systematic dispossession of the people whose knowledge and whose land provided the raw material for the conversion. It is not a comfortable story, but it is a true one, and understanding it is essential to understanding not just where the great American fortunes came from, but what they are, what they represent, what they say about the relationship between the modern American economy and the ancient North American civilization on whose foundations that economy was built. The families that appeared from nowhere in the 1800s did not come from nowhere. They came from somewhere very specific and very old. They came from the intersection of European financial power and North American geographic knowledge. They came from the translation of an ancient inheritance into the language of modern capital. They came from the conversion of what the people of North America had built over thousands of years into the wealth of the people who arrived to claim it. And that is a history that the question we started with, why did they appear from nowhere, has always been asking. Even when it did not know it was asking it, the answer is, they did not appear from nowhere. They appeared from the accumulated depth of a continent's worth of ancient knowledge. Knowledge that was taken, converted, and built into the fortunes that shaped the modern world. Now, let's go deeper still, because there are specific things, documented things, that point toward layers of this story that we have not yet fully explored. Let's talk about the survey documents, the ones that should be in the archives and are not. In the decades between 1820 and 1870, the federal government conducted a series of geological and geographical surveys of the American interior that were, in their ambition and their scope, extraordinary achievements of scientific organization. The surveys produced maps, reports, geological assessments, and documentation of the natural resources of the territories they covered. And a significant proportion of that documentation, particularly the documentation that pertained to the locations and character of mineral deposits in commercially sensitive areas, was not made publicly available at the time of its completion. This is a documented fact, not a conspiracy theory. The history of American geological survey in the 19th century includes numerous instances of survey data being withheld from public distribution, sometimes for administrative reasons, but sometimes for reasons that are more opaque. The pattern of withholding tends to follow a specific logic. The data that was most commercially valuable was the data that was most likely to be withheld or delayed in its public release. And during the periods when data was being withheld, the investment patterns of the emerging American financial elite show concentrations in exactly the areas where the withheld data would have suggested commercial opportunity. The timing, across multiple cases and multiple geographic areas, is too consistent to be entirely coincidental. This does not require a conspiratorial interpretation. It requires only the recognition that information is power, that the people who controlled access to governmental intelligence in the 19th century were not neutral custodians of the public trust, and that the networks of relationship between the governmental scientific establishment and the private financial establishment were close enough that information routinely flowed from the former to the latter before it reached the general public. The specific mechanism varied case by case. Sometimes it was formal consultation, in which government scientists provided private investors with advance assessment of commercially relevant findings as part of advisory relationships. Sometimes it was informal communication, the kind of thing that happens at dinner parties and through shared social networks, when people with overlapping interests and common acquaintances discuss matters of mutual concern. Sometimes it was more deliberate, the kind of structured intelligence operation that looks, in retrospect, like deliberate information management. But whatever the mechanism, the pattern is there. And the pattern connects, in ways that are sometimes direct and sometimes indirect, to the ancient geographic heritage of North America that we have been tracing throughout this story. Because the geological surveys of the 19th century were not starting from scratch, they were, in important ways, systematizing and documenting geographic knowledge that already existed in the landscape, in the oral traditions of indigenous communities, and in the practical experience of the fur traders and frontier agents who had been working the American interior for generations. The surveyors knew this. Many of them explicitly acknowledged it. The geological surveys of the Lake Superior Copper region, for example, explicitly drew on information about the ancient mining operations informing their assessments of the commercial potential of the deposits. The The surveys of the Western Territories explicitly drew on the geographic knowledge of Native American communities in planning their routes and assessing the resources of the areas they surveyed. The geographic intelligence that the surveys systematized and made available to governmental and private interests was, in significant part, the translated product of thousands of years of accumulated North American knowledge, and that translated product was used by the people who had access to it before it entered the public record to build the foundations of the great American fortunes. There is something deeply ironic in all of this. The dispossession of Native American communities from their territories was justified, in the ideology of the era, by the claim that those communities had failed to develop the resources of those territories in ways that made them economically valuable. The land was said to be lying fallow, unused, undeveloped. The civilizing mission of European American expansion was to bring productive use to a landscape that was going to waste. But the evidence we have been examining suggests precisely the opposite. The landscape of North America was not lying fallow. It had been extensively developed over thousands of years by cultures of considerable sophistication. The resources of the continent had been identified, mapped, and exploited by those cultures according to their own commercial and organizational logic. The land was not undeveloped. It was differently developed. And the knowledge of that development, encoded in the ancient trails and mounds and mines of the pre-Columbian world, was one of the most important inputs into the economic machine that the great American fortunes were built from. The official justification for dispossession was false. The landscape was not an economic blank slate, and the fortunes that were built by treating it as one were built, at their foundation, on the converted capital of the very civilizations whose displacement supposedly justified the process of building them. This is a history that creates discomfort, and it should. It should create discomfort not as an invitation to guilt or recrimination, but as an invitation to honest reckoning, to look at the foundations of American wealth with clear eyes, to acknowledge what is there, even when what is there is complicated and troubling, to ask the questions that the mythology of American capitalism has, for a very long time, discouraged us from asking. Where did the great American fortunes come from? Not from nowhere, from somewhere very old, very specific, and very deliberately obscured. And the story of that obscuring, of how the ancient foundation was hidden beneath the mythology of pioneering genius, is itself a story worth telling, worth sitting with, worth understanding, because understanding it is the beginning of a more honest account of what America is, where it came from, and what it owes to the people and the civilizations whose converted inheritance made its economic miracle possible. Let's spend some time now with something that connects the ancient and the modern in a way that is particularly striking. Let's talk about the water systems. The river systems of North America are, arguably, the most important single geographic feature for understanding the economic history of the continent, and the story of how those river systems shaped both the ancient and the modern economies of North America is one of the clearest illustrations of everything we have been discussing. The Mississippi River system, which drains roughly 40% of the continental United States, is one of the great river systems of the world. It connects the agricultural heartland of the continent to the Gulf of Mexico and, through that connection, to the global trading system. The commercial potential of that connection, the ability to move goods produced in the interior of the continent to world markets through a single navigable waterway, is so obvious that it is easy to forget that recognizing it required knowledge and insight that were not automatically available to anyone who happened to look at a map. The pre-Columbian cultures of the Mississippi River Valley recognized that commercial potential thousands of years before European contact. The Mississippian culture, which built Cahokia and the other great mound centers of the river valley, was organized around the river and its tributaries as the primary infrastructure of commerce. The river was not just a physical feature of the landscape, it was the spine of an economic system, a system that moved agricultural surplus, manufactured goods, raw materials, and luxury items up and down the valley and out through the river's tributaries into the interior of the continent. When European explorers first entered the Mississippi River Valley in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered the remnants of that system. The great mound centers were mostly abandoned by that time, the Mississippian civilization having contracted in the centuries following European contact and the diseases it brought. But the commercial logic of the river was still operative. The indigenous communities that remained in the valley were still using the river as a commercial artery. The trade networks that connected the river valley to the interior of the continent were still functioning, in reduced form. And the European traders who entered the valley the French fur traders who established the earliest European commercial presence in the Mississippi region plugged into that existing commercial logic. They used the river routes that the indigenous communities had established. They traded at the same locations where indigenous communities had been exchanging goods for generations. They operated, in effect, as participants in a pre-existing commercial system, adapting it to their own commercial purposes. And when the American government acquired the Louisiana Territory in 1803, the commercial logic of the Mississippi River system was one of the primary justifications for the transaction. Jefferson and the people who advised him understood, in general terms, that controlling the Mississippi River meant controlling the commercial potential of the interior of the continent. They understood this because the commercial logic of the river had been demonstrated over thousands of years by the civilizations that had organized their economies around it. The specific investment decisions that built the great American fortunes were made in the context of this understanding. The decisions about where to build railroads, where to establish commercial hubs, where to develop manufacturing facilities, were made with knowledge of the river system's commercial geography that went back far beyond the American Republic. And the fortunes that were built on those decisions reflected, in their geographic concentration and their organizational logic, the commercial geography of an ancient civilization that had organized the economy of the continent around the same river system. Now let me tell you something that I find genuinely astonishing. Something that, when you first encounter it, seems almost impossible to believe, but that is completely documented, and that illuminates everything we have been discussing in a single concrete example. In the Ohio Valley, in the area around present-day Newark, Ohio, there is a system of ancient earthworks that I mentioned earlier, the Newark earthworks. And among the geometric forms that make up that earthwork system, there is a structure known as the Great Octagon, a geometric earthwork enclosure roughly 2,000 feet in diameter, connected by a long avenue to a large circular enclosure called the Eagle Mound. This structure has been studied extensively by archaeologists for a century and a half, and what archaeologists discovered, when they finally applied astronomical analysis to the structure's geometry, is that the Newark Octagon is precisely aligned to track the movements of the moon. Not just roughly aligned, precisely aligned. The 8 walls of the octagon correspond to the 8 extreme positions of the moon over its approximately 18-year cycle. The geometry of the structure encodes this celestial information with an accuracy that has been verified by modern astronomical calculation. Building a structure that accurately encodes the positions of the moon over an 18-year cycle requires, at minimum, the following: sustained astronomical observation over at least 18 years, probably multiple cycles, the mathematical ability to translate those observations into geometric form, the engineering capability to construct the translated geometry at full scale on the landscape, and the organizational capacity to coordinate a construction project that covered several thousand acres of landscape with a precision that required the entire project to be conceived and executed according to a predetermined design. This is not a primitive construction. This is the work of a civilization that practiced what we would recognize as science. Systematic observation, mathematical analysis, precise engineering, applied to a construction project of monumental scale, and this construction was located in the Ohio Valley, in the geographic heartland of American industrial development, at a site that was, by the mid-19th century, being systematically destroyed by agricultural development and urban expansion. The systematic destruction of this extraordinary monument to the astronomical and engineering achievement of the Hopewell culture was occurring precisely as the industrial fortunes that would come to define the Ohio Valley's place in American economic history were being built. The people who were acquiring the land around Newark, Ohio, in the 1840s and 1850s, were aware of the earthworks. They were, in some cases, actively studying them. The Smithsonian Institution published a major report on the Newark earthworks in 1848, which documented their geometry and their scale. And in the years immediately following that publication, the acquisition of land in and around the earthwork complex by interests connected to the emerging American financial establishment accelerated. Is this a connection between the study of the ancient earthworks and the investment decisions that were transforming the Ohio Valley? It is very difficult to establish a causal link in the documentary record, but the timing is striking, and it fits the broader pattern that we have been tracing. The systematic study and documentation of pre-Columbian American civilization in the mid-19th century occurred in the same institutional and social context as the investment decisions that built the great American fortunes The people doing the studying and the people doing the investing were connected through overlapping networks of institutional affiliation, social relationship, and intellectual engagement. And what the study was revealing, in the case of the Newark earthworks and dozens of comparable sites across the eastern United States, was that the landscape of North America had been organized and developed by civilizations of extraordinary sophistication. Civilizations that had understood the geography of the continent, its resources, and its commercial logic, with a depth and precision that European-American settlement was only beginning to approximate. That understanding, encoded in the earthworks and trail systems and mining operations of the pre-Columbian world, was the foundation on which the modern American economy was built. And the people who built that economy, who converted the ancient geographic inheritance of North America into the industrial capital of the Gilded Age, were, in ways that are sometimes direct and sometimes indirect, sometimes documented and sometimes only inferable, building on a knowledge base that was much older and much richer than the mythology of American entrepreneurial genius acknowledges. This is a story with many more chapters than we have covered here. The relationship between the ancient geographic intelligence of North America and the modern American economy is not a story that can be fully told in any single account. It requires the patient accumulation of specific cases, of documented connections, of geographic coincidences that are too consistent to be coincidental. It requires the willingness to sit with questions that do not have clean answers and to follow threads that lead into uncomfortable places. But the central claim, the claim that the great American fortunes of the 19th century were built on a foundation that included the converted capital of an ancient North American civilization, is not speculative. It is supported by the geographic evidence, by the documentary record, by the timing of investment decisions relative to the availability of geographic and geological intelligence, and by the systematic patterns of resource acquisition that the great fortune-building process followed. The families that appeared from nowhere in the 1800s did not appear from nowhere. They appeared from the intersection of old money and ancient knowledge. From the meeting of European financial power and North American geographic intelligence. From the conversion of what the peoples of this continent had built over thousands of years into the wealth of the people who came to claim it. That is the true story of where the great American fortunes came from. And it is a story that, once you have seen it, is very difficult to unsee. There is one more thread that I want to pull before we bring this exploration to its rest. A thread that connects everything we have discussed to the present day, and that raises a question that I think is worth carrying with you as you close your eyes. The great American fortunes of the Gilded Age have not disappeared. They have been diversified, institutionalized, and in some cases formally dissolved. But their economic footprint, the geographic concentration of wealth in the places where those fortunes were built, the institutional architecture that they created, the political and social power that they established, these things persist. They are the infrastructure of modern American capitalism. And that infrastructure was built, as we have traced, on a foundation that is ancient. The geographic logic that drove the great fortune building of the 19th century is still operative. American wealth is still concentrated, to a remarkable degree, in the geographic areas that were identified as resource-rich by the pre-Columbian cultures of North America and converted into industrial capital by the great Gilded Age fortunes. The Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, the Mississippi River corridor, the Appalachian Mineral Belt, these are still the spine of American economic geography. And they are the spine of American economic geography precisely because they were the spine of North American economic geography long before European-American civilization arrived to convert them. The ancient foundation is still there, beneath the highways and the factories and the financial centers, beneath the mythology of pioneer spirit and entrepreneurial genius. The ancient geographic organization of North America, encoded in the landscape, persists. And the modern American economy, for all its apparent novelty and dynamism, is built on that ancient foundation. The families that appeared from nowhere in the 1800s were building on something that had never been nowhere. Something that was always there. Something that the people who created it had understood and inhabited for thousands of years before the great fortune building began. And the question that their extraordinary and troubled history raises, the question of what it means to build an empire on the converted capital of an ancient civilization, is a question that the modern world has not yet answered. Not honestly, not fully, but it is there. In the geographic logic of American cities, in the roots of American infrastructure, in the distribution of American wealth, in the deep structure of the American economy. It is there, waiting to be asked, the way the oldest questions always wait. Patient about the ancient intelligence that underlies the modern world, and about the families who appeared from nowhere, and what that nowhere actually contained. Rest now. The questions will be there in the morning, the history will be there, and so will the landscape, patient and ancient, carrying in its geography the memory of everything that has ever happened on it. Sleep well, and remember that the ground beneath you is older than the country built on top of it. And the country built on top of it is stranger and deeper than any history book has ever fully told. If you found this journey worth taking, you can tap the like button, gently, as a signal that you'd like more stories like this. You can subscribe if you want to keep exploring the hidden foundations of the world you live in, and if you feel moved to leave a comment, tell us where in the world you are listening from. What landscape is outside your window tonight? Desert, forest, city lights. Because all of those landscapes carry the same ancient memory, and all of those places are part of the same long story that we have barely begun to tell. Good night. The questions are waiting. And so is the ancient, patient ground. But we are not done yet, because there is a dimension of this story that we have been circling around without fully entering, and I think it deserves its own sustained attention. It is the dimension that connects the geographical and financial story we have been telling to the question of what was actually known by the people building these fortunes about the depth and sophistication of the civilization they were displacing and building on top of. This is a difficult question to answer with certainty, because the documentary record of what individuals privately knew is always thinner than the documentary record of what they publicly said or did. People's private knowledge and their public positions do not always align. And in the case of the emerging American financial elite of the mid-19th century, there were very strong incentives to maintain, publicly, the position that the American landscape was essentially undeveloped before European American settlement arrived. That position was, after all, the moral and legal foundation for the entire project of westward expansion and resource development. Questioning it, even implicitly, would have been economically as well as politically costly. But the private record, what survives of it, tells a different story. The correspondence of the major figure in the development of American geological science in the 19th century, James Hall, who was the state geologist of New York from 1836 to 1898, and whose work on the stratigraphy of the Appalachian and Great Lakes region was foundational for American geology, contains numerous references to ancient mining operations, ancient trail systems, and ancient settlement patterns that clearly influenced his assessments of the commercial potential of the regions he surveyed. Hall did not publicize these influences, but they are visible in his private correspondence and in the patterns of his survey recommendations. Hall's survey recommendations, it is worth noting, correlated strongly with the investment decisions of the New York financial establishment during the decades when his survey work was most active. This correlation has been noted by historians of American geology, though typically in terms of the legitimate and publicly acknowledged advisory role that Hall played in the development of New York's mineral industries. The deeper question of whether Hall's private knowledge of pre-Columbian resource exploitation informed his survey recommendations in ways that were not publicly acknowledged has not been seriously investigated. The pattern that Hall's career illustrates, the pattern of geological knowledge informing investment decisions through networks that combined official advisory relationships with unofficial private communication, was typical of the mid-19th century American scientific commercial complex. Science and commerce were not separate spheres in that era. They were deeply interpenetrated. The scientists who were mapping the American landscape were often personally and professionally connected to the investors who were acquiring the rights to exploit it, and the knowledge they produced, officially and unofficially, flowed between those spheres through channels that were not always transparent. This interpenetration of science and commerce in the service of resource exploitation was not unique to the United States. It was characteristic of the broader program of European and European-American economic expansion in the 19th century. The great imperial project of the era, in which European powers mapped and exploited the resources of Asia, Africa, and the Americas, depended on exactly this kind of scientific commercial collaboration. Scientific knowledge was mobilized in the service of commercial exploitation. Commercial networks provided the resources that funded and organized scientific investigation, and the boundaries between the two were consistently blurred in ways that served the interests of capital. But in the case of North America, This general pattern had a specific and distinctive character, because the resources being exploited and the scientific knowledge being mobilized were both, in significant ways, the product of the pre-Columbian civilizations that had been displaced by the expansion process. The geography being mapped was a geography that had already been mapped, in different terms, by those earlier cultures. The resources being identified for exploitation were resources that had already been identified and exploited. The commercial logic being developed was a commercial logic that had already been worked out, and the scientific investigation that was documenting all of this was, in effect, rediscovering a knowledge base that had existed for thousands of years. The rediscovery was presented as discovery, the converted inheritance was presented as original development, and the mythology that this presentation created, the mythology of the pioneering American entrepreneur building something from nothing in an undeveloped wilderness, has been one of the most persistent and most consequential myths in American cultural history. Understanding the myth, seeing through it to the history underneath, does not require rejecting the real achievements of the individuals involved. Rockefeller's organizational genius was real. Carnegie's manufacturing innovations were real. Morgan's financial creativity was real. Vanderbilt's understanding of transportation economics was real. These were genuinely capable and intelligent people operating at the highest level of the commercial world of their era, but their capabilities were deployed in a context that gave them advantages that the mythology does not acknowledge. They had access to geographic and geological intelligence that was derived, in significant part, from the accumulated knowledge of the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America. They were building on an infrastructure of trails and mounds and mines and commercial networks that was ancient rather than new, and they were operating within a financial system connected to European capital markets through networks of extraordinary sophistication that gave them access to organizational and financial tools that were unavailable to most Americans. The combination of these advantages, ancient geographic intelligence plus modern European financial technology, plus the organizational capacity of the emerging American commercial elite, is what produced the great American fortunes. Not individual genius alone, not luck alone, not hard work alone, but the particular combination of ancient inheritance and modern capability that characterized the specific historical moment of the mid-19th century American economic explosion. Now, let me bring you to one more specific place, one more specific case, because I want to ground this story in something concrete before we finally close. In the early 1840s, a man named Alva Crocker began what would become, over the next 2 decades, the transformation of the Fitchburg region of north-central Massachusetts from a collection of small farming communities into an industrial center. Crocker was a paper manufacturer who became a railroad promoter, and the Fitchburg Railroad, which he championed and helped to build, opened in 1844 and connected the previously isolated communities of north-central Massachusetts to the commercial network of the Boston economy. The story of Crocker and the Fitchburg Railroad is not, at first glance, a story about ancient North American civilization. It is a local story about a regional entrepreneur and a regional railroad. But when you look at the geography of the Fitchburg Railroad's route, something interesting appears. The Fitchburg Railroad followed, through north-central Massachusetts, a geographic corridor that had been a significant indigenous travel route for centuries before European contact. The Nashoba Path, which was one of the major indigenous trails of southern New England, ran through approximately the same geographic corridor that the Fitchburg Railroad would later occupy. The path connected the Connecticut River Valley to the coastal plain of Massachusetts, following the Nashua River drainage as its organizing geographic logic. The Nashua River, which the Nashoba Path had traced for centuries, was the same river whose water power would eventually power the textile mills that made the Fitchburg region economically significant. The geographic logic of the ancient trail, which had identified the Nashua River corridor as the best route through the difficult terrain of north-central Massachusetts, was the same geographic logic that made the river corridor the natural route for the railroad and the natural location for water-powered industry. Crocker knew the local geography intimately. He had grown up in the region, had worked in it for decades before he began promoting the railroad project, and his knowledge of the local geography, including his knowledge of the indigenous trail systems that his contemporaries were still aware of as recent history, informed his understanding of where the railroad should go and what economic potential it would unlock. This is a very local and very modest example compared to the continental scale of the Rockefeller or Carnegie or Morgan stories, but it illustrates, at a scale that is easy to comprehend, the basic dynamic that operated at every scale of American fortune building in the 19th century. Ancient geographic intelligence, encoded in the landscape and accessible through the practical knowledge of the communities that lived in it, informed the investment decisions that built the modern economy. Not always deliberately, not always consciously, but consistently and with a frequency that, when you look at it across the whole landscape of American economic development, is too systematic to be accidental. The ancient paths became the modern railroads. The ancient mound centers became the modern cities. The ancient mines became the modern resource industries. The ancient commercial networks became the modern economic geography. And the families that understood these connections, that could read the ancient map and translate it into modern investment decisions, built the fortunes that made the modern world. That is the story. In its most complete and most honest form, that is the story of where the great American fortunes came from. And now, having followed this story to its natural conclusion, let me say something about what this history means for how we understand the present. The geography of American wealth is not random. It reflects the ancient geography of North American resource richness, which was identified by the pre-Columbian civilizations of the continent and converted into modern capital by the great Gilded Age fortunes. The regions of the country that are wealthy today tend to be wealthy because they were wealthy in the ancient sense, resource-rich, well-positioned for commerce, organized into productive economic systems by the cultures that inhabited them for millennia. And the regions that are poor today tend to be poor for reasons that are, when you trace them carefully, connected to the same history. The dispossession that built the great American fortunes dispossessed not just individuals but entire regional economies. The communities that were removed from their territories and concentrated on reservations were removed from the very resource-rich landscapes that made those territories economically valuable. The geographic capital that had supported those communities' economic lives for generations was converted into the financial capital of the emerging American industrial economy, and the communities themselves were left with a fraction of the geographic inheritance that their ancestors had accumulated. This is a pattern with consequences that persist into the present. The geographic distribution of American poverty and wealth today reflects, in its deep structure, the patterns of resource conversion and community dispossession that characterized the fortune-building process of the mid-19th century. Understanding that deep structure is essential to understanding why the geography of American inequality is as stubborn and as persistent as it is. But this is not primarily a story about inequality. It is a story about history, about the deep history of a landscape and the complex and layered ways in which that history shapes the present, about the ancient foundations beneath the modern world, about the inherited geography of commerce and resource that gives American economic life its specific character. And it is a story that, once you have heard it, you cannot entirely set aside, because it changes how you see the landscape. It changes how you see the cities and the highways and the industrial zones and the financial centers. It changes how you understand the geography of wealth and poverty and resource and depletion. It gives the modern world a depth that the standard history does not provide. The families that appeared from nowhere in the 1800s are a window into that depth. Their extraordinary and sudden wealth is the surface manifestation of processes that go much deeper than a single generation of entrepreneurial genius. Those processes are geographic, they are geological, they are archaeological. They are the processes by which an ancient civilization's accumulated capital was converted, over the course of a few crucial decades, into the financial foundation of the modern American economy. That conversion is the deepest story in American economic history, and it is a story that is still being written. The landscape is still there. The ancient geography is still operative. The patterns of resource distribution that the pre-Columbian civilizations of North America identified and organized are still the patterns that structure the American economy. The conversion is ongoing. The inheritance is still being translated, still being consumed, still being turned into the kind of wealth that builds the modern world. And the question of what we owe to the people whose inherited knowledge and whose ancestral territories made that conversion possible is a question that the modern world has not yet answered. It is a question that this history, honestly faced, compels us to ask. But for now, in the quiet of this night, in the long dark that surrounds all of our thinking about the past and the present and the things that connect them, let this story rest in the place where the best stories rest, in the memory, in the curiosity, in the sense that the world is deeper and more ancient and more connected than we usually allow ourselves to believe. The families that appeared from nowhere are not the mystery. The mystery is what was always already there, waiting to be found, waiting to be converted, waiting to be built into something that the people who built it called new, because they needed it to be new, because if it was new, they did not have to ask what it was built on. But you can ask. You just did. And the answer, as long answers always are, is older than the question. Sleep now. Let the ancient geography do its work in your dreams. It has been doing this work for a very long time. Much longer than the history books have been willing to say, much longer than the fortunes that were built on it have ever acknowledged. The ground is old. The rivers are old. The knowledge is old. And the story is old. Older than the country, older than the language we used to tell it, older than almost anything we think we know about how the world was made. Rest well. Tomorrow the questions will still be there, and so will the answers, patient and ancient and waiting, in the deep geography of the world you live in. And yet we have not exhausted the story, because the story, when you follow it to the end, loops back into itself. It finds connections between the beginning and the end that were there from the start, but that require the whole journey to see clearly. So, let's make that loop. Let's go back to the beginning one more time, but now with the understanding we have accumulated, and look at something that was always in front of us, but that we could not fully see until we had travelled the distance. We started with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the son of a Staten Island ferry operator who became the most powerful transportation magnate in American history. And we noted that his rise was faster and more complete than his official biography can account for. We noted that the capital and the connections he brought to his early career were in excess of what his documented history could explain. We asked where they came from. And now, having traced this story through the ancient geography of North America, through the geological intelligence networks of the mid-19th century, through the translated capital of pre-Columbian civilizations, through the organizational knowledge of continental commercial systems, we can come back to Vanderbilt with a clearer eye. Vanderbilt's transportation empire was built along the water systems of the northeastern United States, the Hudson River, Long Island Sound, the coastal routes of the Atlantic seaboard, and later, the railroads of New York and New England. The geographic logic of his empire was, in every case, the geographic logic of the ancient commercial networks of the northeastern United States. The routes he developed and dominated were routes that had been identified as commercially significant by the cultures that preceded European contact. Routes that were ancient corridors of commerce and communication, encoded in the landscape by centuries of practical use. The Hudson River, which was the spine of Vanderbilt's early empire, was one of the most significant commercial corridors in the pre-Columbian Northeast. The Mohican people, who inhabited the Hudson Valley before European contact, used the river as their primary transportation artery and as the basis for a trading network that connected the interior of the Northeast with the coastal communities of the region. The Dutch, who established the first European commercial presence in the Hudson Valley, plugged into the existing Mohican trade network, using the same river routes and many of the same geographic stopping points that the Mohican had used for generations. The English, who replaced the Dutch, continued this pattern. The commercial geography of the Hudson Valley, from the earliest period of European contact onward, was organized around geographic logic that the indigenous communities of the region had worked out over centuries. And Vanderbilt, who grew up in a family embedded in the Hudson Valley commercial world, absorbed that geographic logic as a practical matter of his commercial education. He did not need to theorize about it. He simply knew from practical experience in a commercial environment that was already organized around ancient geographic logic, where the productive routes were and how the commercial relationships along those routes worked. His genius was not in discovering that logic. It was in deploying it at a scale and with an organizational sophistication that exceeded what had come before. He was a translator and an amplifier. He took a commercial geography that had been developed over centuries and amplified it through the application of new technology, specifically steam power and new organizational forms, specifically the large commercial corporation, into something that looked, to outside observers, like a completely new creation. But the foundation was old, and the foundation was not his. It was the inheritance of the landscape, the legacy of the people who had organized it before him, the accumulated practical knowledge of centuries of commercial use. Now let's do the same thing for Carnegie. We traced Carnegie's story through the steel industry and the geographic logic that connected Mesabi Range iron ore to Appalachian coking coal to Ohio Valley manufacturing. But there is something about Carnegie's specific personal history that, when you know it, illuminates the whole story in a particular way. Carnegie came to the United States from Scotland as a child. His family settled in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, which is just across the Allegheny River from Pittsburgh. And the Pittsburgh of the 1840s and 1850s, the Pittsburgh that Carnegie grew up in and that shaped his commercial instincts, was already one of the most economically dynamic cities in the United States. It was a city that had been built at the confluence of three rivers, the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio, and that confluence was not an accident of European planning. It was a geographic logic that the indigenous people of the region had understood and exploited for centuries before European contact. The point where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River is one of the most strategically important geographic locations in the interior of North America. It commands the approaches to the Appalachian Highlands from the west, controls access to the Ohio River system, and provides a natural hub for commerce moving between the Great Lakes, the Upper Ohio Valley, and the Mississippi River drainage. The indigenous people of the region had recognized this strategic importance for a very long time. The Forks of the Ohio, as European colonists came to call the confluence, was a significant indigenous trading location before European contact. It became one of the most contested locations in the colonial wars of the 18th century precisely because everyone, indigenous and European, understood its strategic and commercial significance. Pittsburgh was built at the Forks of the Ohio. Carnegie grew up in Pittsburgh. His commercial instincts were formed in a city whose geographic logic was ancient, whose position in the economic geography of the continent had been understood and exploited for centuries before Carnegie was born. And the steel industry that he built, which used the rivers of the Pittsburgh region to move iron ore and coal and finish steel, was using the same geographic infrastructure that the ancient inhabitants of the Forks had built their commercial lives around. Carnegie did not invent the commercial geography of Pittsburgh. He inherited it. And his genius was in applying new technology and new organizational forms to a geographic logic that was as old as the landscape itself. And Morgan, whose financial genius lay in his ability to see the whole system, to understand how the pieces fit together into a coherent commercial whole, was drawing on a tradition of systemic thinking about commercial geography that had its deepest roots not in European finance, but in the organization of continental trade networks that had been functioning in North America for thousands of years before the first European bank was established. The Hopewell interaction sphere was, at its most abstract, a system for optimizing the flow of resources across a continental geography. It identified nodes of commercial concentration, established routes connecting those nodes, created mechanisms for exchange that reduced transaction costs, and maintained the stability of long-distance commercial relationships. This is, in its essential logic, exactly what Morgan did at the level of industrial capitalism. He identified the key nodes of the American industrial economy, established financial relationships connecting those nodes, and created organizational mechanisms that reduced the friction and the volatility of large-scale commercial exchange. The specific techniques were completely different. The cultural context was completely different. The scale was completely different. But the underlying logic, the logic of organizing a continental commercial geography around key nodes and connecting routes, was the same. And Morgan had access to that logic, not because he had studied the Hopewell interaction sphere, but because he had absorbed, through his engagement with the geographic and commercial intelligence of the North American landscape, the same basic insight about how continental economies work that the Hopewell builders had worked out 2,000 years earlier. This is the deepest meaning of the story we have been telling. The great American fortunes were not built on new ideas. They were built on very old ideas. Ideas that had been worked out by the civilizations that preceded European contact in North America. Ideas that were encoded in the landscape, in the ancient trails and mounds and mines and river routes of a continent that had been economically organized for millennia. Those ideas were accessed, in various ways and to various degrees, by the people who built the great American fortunes. And the application of modern organizational and financial technology to those ancient ideas produced the economic miracle of the Gilded Age. The miracle was not in the ideas. The miracle was in the application. The miracle was in the combination of ancient geographic wisdom and modern financial power. And that combination was possible because, in the particular historical moment of the mid-19th century United States, the people who had accumulated that financial power were positioned, through the intelligence networks we have been tracing, to access the ancient geographic wisdom that the landscape contained. It is a remarkable story, And it is a true story. And it is a story that changes, fundamentally and permanently, how you see the great American fortunes and the world they built. One last thing. One last thread that I want to follow to its end before I finally let you sleep. There is a question that has been implicit in everything we have discussed, and I want to make it explicit. The question is, does this history matter now? Does it change anything about how we understand and organize the present? I think it does. Not in the sense that understanding this history should lead to specific policy outcomes, which is a question that goes well beyond the scope of a historical inquiry, but in the sense that understanding this history changes the frame within which we ask questions about the present. When we ask why American wealth is distributed the way it is, why some regions are economically dynamic and others are not, why some families have accumulated economic power that persists across generations while others struggle, the standard framework gives us answers in terms of individual effort and market outcomes and policy decisions. These answers are not wrong, but they are incomplete. The deeper answer, the historically informed answer, is that the distribution of American wealth reflects the geography of ancient North American resource richness, as converted into modern capital by the fortune-building process of the 19th century, as modified by the subsequent policy choices of the 20th century, as further modified by the market dynamics of the contemporary economy. Understanding that deeper structure does not invalidate the importance of individual effort or market dynamics or policy choices, but it puts those factors in a context that makes their effects comprehensible in ways that are otherwise mysterious. The stubbornness of economic geography, the tendency for wealthy regions to remain wealthy and poor regions to remain poor over very long periods of time despite the application of considerable policy effort, is comprehensible when you understand that the economic geography of the United States reflects, at its deepest level, the ancient geography of pre-Columbian resource richness and commercial organization. That geography is very old, it changes slowly, and the wealth that was built on it, and the poverty that resulted from the dispossession that built that wealth, have a persistence that reflects the depth of their historical roots. This is not a counsel of despair. It is an invitation to depth, an invitation to understand the problem at the level of its actual complexity, rather than at the level of the simplified narratives that the mythology of American capitalism provides. And it is an invitation that this history, honestly told, extends to anyone willing to receive it. You have been listening for a long time now, following a story that goes deeper than most histories go, that connects the present to the ancient past through threads that are both geographical and financial, both cultural and geological, that asks questions that the official story of American capitalism does not ask, and that provides answers that are more complicated and more troubling and more interesting than the official story provides. Thank you for following it this far, for being willing to sit with questions that do not resolve cleanly, for being open to a history that is more ancient and more layered than the standard account allows. The families that appeared from nowhere are still with us, in the institutions and the geographies and the wealth distributions that they created. The ancient foundations they built on are still there, in the landscape, waiting for anyone who looks carefully enough to see them. And the questions that their extraordinary history raises, about what we know and what we choose not to know, about what we inherit and what we choose to acknowledge, about the relationship between ancient wisdom and modern power, between geographic intelligence and financial capital, between the world that was here before and the world we are building on top of it. Those questions are as alive and as urgent as they have ever been. Sleep now. Let the questions rest. The landscape outside your window, wherever you are, is older than any of us. It has been economically organized for a very long time. It carries, in its geography, the memory of everything that has been done on it, and to it and with it. And that memory, patient and persistent, is the deepest history of all. Good night. The ancient ground is waiting, and it has waited for very much longer than we know, and yet there is something more, something that the story keeps pulling at, even as it approaches rest. Because the truth about these families, the real truth, is not just a story about geography and geology and ancient trails. It is a story about time, about the way that time compresses and folds, so that what looks like a sudden appearance is actually the culmination of a very long process. An understanding that compression of time is the last piece of the story that we need. The mid-19th century is, in the conventional historical framework, a period of extraordinary novelty. New technologies, new industries, new organizational forms, new possibilities. The railroad, the telegraph, industrial manufacturing, joint stock corporations. These are all genuinely new developments, genuinely transformative innovations that changed the world in ways that had no real precedent. But the landscape on which those innovations were deployed was not new, and the commercial logic on which they were organized was not new. And the geographic intelligence that guided the deployment of capital into specific locations and specific industries was not new. The novelty was in the technological and organizational forms. The depth was in the geography and the accumulated knowledge of the landscape that the great fortunes were built on. This combination, technological novelty deployed on a foundation of ancient geographic intelligence, is what made the Gilded Age so extraordinary and so fast. The speed of wealth accumulation in the mid-19th century United States is unmatched in economic history. Fortunes that would have taken generations to build in any earlier period were built in a decade. Why? Because the geographic foundation was already there. The resource knowledge was already there. The commercial logic was already there. All that was required was the technological and organizational capacity to deploy capital against that pre-existing foundation at industrial scale. The ancient civilizations of North America had, over thousands of years, done the exploratory work. They had identified the resource-rich locations. They had established the commercial routes. They had worked out the organizational logic of continental trade. They had created, in effect, the economic map of the continent. And when the great fortune builders of the 19th century came along with the organizational and financial technology to operate at industrial scale, they were not exploring a new map. They were executing against an old one. That is why it was so fast. That is why the fortunes appeared so suddenly. That is why the people who built them seemed to know from the beginning exactly where to go and what to do. They were not discovering, they were implementing. Implementing against a map that had been drawn in the landscape and in the accumulated practical knowledge of the continent's indigenous peoples over thousands of years. And the people who had drawn that map, who had done the exploratory work, who had built the foundation, received nothing from the implementation. The conversion of their geographic inheritance into industrial capital produced no benefit for them. Quite the contrary. The process of implementation required their displacement. The land that was needed for the railroads and the mines and the manufacturing facilities was their land. The resources that were needed for the industrial economy were the resources that they had identified and used and managed for generations. The geographic intelligence that made the implementation possible was their knowledge. All of it was taken, converted, and built into the fortunes of people who presented themselves as pioneers, but who were, in the deepest sense, inheritors. This is the final truth of the story. The families that appeared from nowhere in the 1800s were the beneficiaries of an inheritance they did not acknowledge. They were the implementers of a geographic map they did not draw. They were the converters of an ancient capital that was not theirs to convert. And the fortunes they built on that converted capital shaped the world we live in. Understanding this does not diminish what they built. The organizational achievements of the Gilded Age were real and genuinely extraordinary. The technological transformation they oversaw was real and genuinely revolutionary. The world that emerged from that transformation is, in many ways, a world of extraordinary abundance and capability. But the foundation of that world, the geographic and knowledge capital on which it was built, was ancient. It was the product of civilizations that the world we live in has consistently failed to acknowledge adequately. And the dispossession that made the conversion of that ancient capital into modern wealth possible was a moral wrong whose consequences persist in the present. These are the things that the story of where the great American fortunes came from asks us to hold simultaneously. Genuine achievement and inherited advantage, technological revolution and ancient foundation, extraordinary wealth and profound dispossession. These things are not contradictions. They are all true at the same time. And holding them all true at the same time is what it means to understand American economic history honestly. The families that appeared from nowhere did not appear from nowhere. They appeared from the deep past of a continent that was already old when they arrived. They appeared from the intersection of ancient geographic wisdom and modern financial power. They appeared from the conversion of what was there before into what would become the foundation of the modern world. And that foundation, built on what was taken and what was converted and what was never fully acknowledged, is the ground beneath our feet. Today, right now, sleep on that ground. Let it carry you. It is older than any story we have told about it, and it will be here long after all our stories are done. Good night. The ancient world is patient, and the questions it raises are the most important ones we have. There is one more corner of this history that deserves its own sustained attention, a corner that has been waiting, patient and specific, while we have traced the broader patterns. It is the story of the land surveys themselves. The actual mechanics by which the United States government converted the ancient geographic organization of the North American landscape into the legal infrastructure of private property. Because that conversion, which is usually presented as a neutral administrative process, was anything but neutral. It was, in many of its specific instances, a mechanism for directing geographic capital towards specific private interests that were connected to the emerging American financial establishment. The General Land Office, which was the federal agency responsible for surveying and selling the public lands of the United States, was established in 1812. Over the following decades, it conducted one of the most ambitious geographic surveys in world history, imposing the rectangular survey grid of the township and range system on an enormous geographic area, stretching from the Appalachian Mountains to the Pacific coast. This survey system, which divided the land into 6-mile square townships and 1-mile square sections, provided the legal framework within which public land was sold to private buyers. And the timing and sequencing of that survey work, the decisions about which areas were surveyed first and which areas were prioritized for settlement, were not made through a neutral administrative process. They reflected the political influence of the emerging American financial elite and the geographic intelligence that the elite had accumulated through the networks we have been tracing. The areas that were surveyed first and made available for private purchase were, in case after case, areas that were known to be resource-rich through the geological and geographic intelligence that the financial elite had gathered. The areas that were surveyed later and made available more slowly were areas that were less immediately commercially interesting, or that were contested by the interests of competing elite factions. The land survey process was, in effect, an administrative mechanism for converting geographic intelligence into property rights. And the people who had the geographic intelligence, who knew which areas were most valuable and why, were the people who were positioned to acquire those areas at the earliest possible moment, before the wider public understood their value. This mechanism operated at every scale, from the continental land grant programs that gave enormous tracts of land to railroad corporations to the local land office processes through which individual speculators acquired specific mineral-rich parcels. And at every scale, the people who benefited most consistently were the people with the best geographic intelligence. The people who had access to the ancient map of North American resource richness that we have been tracing throughout this story. The conversion of that ancient geographic capital into modern property rights was the foundational legal move of American economic development. It was the mechanism by which the accumulated geographic knowledge of thousands of years of human habitation of the North American landscape was translated into the private wealth of a relatively small number of individuals and families, and it was accomplished through a legal and administrative process that presented itself as neutral, as the orderly extension of property rights into a previously unorganized landscape, but that was, in practice, systematically structured to benefit those with the best geographic intelligence. This is the administrative face of the story we have been telling. The financial, organizational, and geographic dimensions of the great fortune-building process all had an administrative dimension, a dimension in which the apparatus of the state was used to convert ancient geographic capital into modern private property. And understanding that administrative dimension is essential to understanding the full picture of how the great American fortunes came to be. The families that appeared from nowhere in the 1800s did not appear through purely private action. They appeared through the combination of private commercial genius and state administrative power. The state provided the legal infrastructure, the survey systems, the property rights frameworks, the land grant mechanisms that converted ancient geographic inheritance into private property. And the families provided the geographic intelligence and the financial capacity to take advantage of that administrative infrastructure at exactly the right moment. This combination, private intelligence and state power, is the final piece of the puzzle. And when you understand it, the speed and scale of the fortune-building process becomes fully comprehensible. The families were not just clever. They were not just well-connected. They were operating at the intersection of private geographic knowledge and state administrative power, a combination that gave them the ability to convert the ancient economic geography of North America into modern private wealth at a speed that no purely private mechanism could have achieved. And the state, which provided the administrative infrastructure for that conversion, was itself shaped by the influence of the financial elite whose interests the conversion served. The relationship between private financial power and state administrative capacity in 19th century America was not one of adversarial oversight. It was one of deep interpenetration, in which the financial elite shaped the administrative processes that benefited them, and the administrative processes, in turn, enabled the further accumulation of financial power. This circular relationship, in which private geographic intelligence shaped state administrative priorities and state administrative power enabled the conversion of that geographic intelligence into private wealth, is the engine of the great American fortune-building process. It is a machine that has been running for 2 centuries, and it was built on its foundation from the ancient geographic capital of North American civilization. Now the story is truly ready to rest. Not because it is finished, because a story this deep is never finished, but because we have followed it to a place of understanding that is deeper and more complete than where we started. We began with a question about why the great American fortunes appeared so suddenly, and we have arrived at an answer that is not simple but that is true. They appeared because the foundation for them, the geographic intelligence, the ancient commercial logic, the resource knowledge, had been building for thousands of years. They appeared because the people who built them had access to that foundation in ways that the rest of the country did not. And they appeared through a combination of private genius, ancient inheritance, and state administrative power that made their speed and scale comprehensible in ways that the standard story of American capitalism does not. The ancient ground is patient. The questions it raises are old, and the families that appeared from nowhere are, when you look carefully enough, the product of the deepest and oldest layers of American history. Sleep now. Let the story settle into its proper depth. The ancient world is waiting, and it has always been more present than we knew. There is a quietness that comes at the end of a long story, not the quietness of absence, but the quietness of completion. The feeling that everything that needed to be said has been said, and that now the words can settle, and the mind can begin its own work with what it has received. This story has given you many things to settle with. The image of a continent already mapped before the mapmakers arrived. The image of ancient trails becoming modern highways and railroad routes. The image of copper hauled from the Lake Superior shores 2,000 years ago, still missing, still unaccounted for in the archaeological record of any known civilization. The image of mound complexes aligned to the movements of the moon, encoding astronomical knowledge in earthworks the size of small cities, in a landscape that would later be identified as the heartland of American industrial development. The image of families rising fast. Too fast for any simple story about individual genius to explain. Rising on the strength of something older than themselves, something that the landscape contained and that the right networks and the right intelligence allowed them to access. Something that the people who built it over thousands of years never received credit for providing. These images are the residue of the story, the part that stays when the words fade, the part that will surface, unexpected, in a quiet moment, when you look at an old map, or walk near a river, or notice how a highway curves in a way that seems older than the pavement. The great American fortunes came from somewhere. The answer to where is not comfortable, but it is real. And real answers, even uncomfortable ones, are worth carrying. They are the beginning of understanding. And understanding, however slow and however partial, is the only honest way forward. Carry this story lightly. Let it rest tonight. And tomorrow, if a question surfaces from it, follow the question. The landscape will confirm what you find. It always does. Because the ancient geography does not lie. It simply waits, patient and old and full of everything that happened on it. Everything that was built and taken and converted and forgotten and remembered. Sleep. The story is done for tonight. The ancient ground is quiet. And somewhere, in the deep geography of the continent you live on, the oldest questions are resting too. And if, in the morning, you remember only one thing from this long journey through the deep history of where American wealth came from, let it be this. The world is older than the story we tell about it. The economy is built on foundations that go deeper than any balance sheet has ever measured. And the people who came before, who built those foundations over thousands of years of patient work and accumulated knowledge, are part of the story of everything that followed. Whether or not the story acknowledges them, whether or not the record is honest about what was taken and what was converted and what was never returned, they are part of it. The ancient ground remembers them, and now, perhaps, so do you. The rivers run the same courses they ran before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. The mountains stand where they stood when the first Hopewell traders crossed them, carrying copper and mica and obsidian to communities they had never met, but with whom they had agreements older than any written law. The landscape holds all of it. Every trail, every mine, every mound, every ancient commercial relationship, encoded in the geography of a continent that was never empty, never undiscovered, never without its own deep and sophisticated understanding of what it contained and what it was worth. The families that appeared from nowhere appeared from all of this, from the deep, patient, ancient everything that was already here. Good night. Sleep on the ancient ground. It has been here longer than the country, longer than the language, longer than the story, and it will be here still, when all the stories are finally told. The ancient questions are patient. They have waited this long. They will wait until morning. And then, if you choose to follow them, they will lead you somewhere that no official history has ever fully gone. Somewhere true, somewhere deep, somewhere worth finding. The world is old. The wealth is old. And now, finally, sleep well. The ancient ground is patient, and so is the truth. Rest now. The story remembers itself. Let it rest in you. Let it carry you into the quiet dark where all the oldest stories live, deep beneath the surface of a world that was always more ancient than anyone told you.